Welcome, fellow dreamer. Tonight, we journey through the ancient art of herbal medicine, where the wisdom of nature has offered healing to humanity for thousands of years across every corner of our world. This story unfolds with soothing music and gentle abstract imagery, revealing the hidden wonders and remarkable tales of how simple plants became the foundation of medicine itself, quietly feeding your curiosity as you drift toward peaceful rest. So take a deep breath, settle into the softness around you, and allow your mind and eyes to rest as we explore nature's timeless pharmacy together. The first medicines were not discovered in laboratories or hospitals, but in the quiet spaces between hunger and survival, where early humans moved carefully through forests and across grasslands, watching, tasting, and learning which plants might ease their suffering. Long before written language, before cities rose from the earth, before agriculture transformed human civilization, our distant ancestors were already healers. They carried within their minds a knowledge that would be passed down through countless generations, an understanding of which leaves might cool a fever, which roots could calm an aching stomach, which bark might dull the throb of pain. We know this not merely through stories or speculation, but through evidence preserved in the most unlikely of places. In a cave in northern Iraq, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. There, in the ancient burial site known as Shanidar Cave, lay the remains of a Neanderthal man who had been laid to rest approximately 60,000 years ago. Soil samples taken from around his grave revealed pollen from 8 different plant species. These were not random wildflowers scattered by wind. They were plants with properties that modern herbalists would recognize immediately: yarrow, cornflower, groundsel, grape hyacinth. Plants that reduce inflammation, plants that ease pain, plants that have been used medicinally by humans across millennia. Whether these plants were placed there ceremonially, or whether this individual had used them in life, we cannot say with absolute certainty. But the presence of these specific species suggests something profound: that the relationship between humans and healing plants extends so far back in time that even our closest evolutionary cousins may have understood their value. The learning process must have been gradual, built over thousands of years through careful observation. Early humans watched animals, noting which plants sick creatures sought out. A bear with an upset stomach might dig for certain roots. A wounded deer might rest beside particular herbs. These observations became knowledge, and knowledge became survival. Trial and error played its role as well, though we can only imagine the courage or desperation required to taste an unfamiliar plant. Some experiments ended in disaster. Certain leaves brought sleep from which there was no waking. Certain berries caused violent sickness. Certain roots unleashed visions that fractured the mind. But other discoveries brought relief. A paste made from certain leaves drew infection from wounds. The bark of particular trees, when chewed, somehow diminished pain. Teas brewed from specific flowers could ease the grip of fever. This knowledge was precious, quite literally a matter of life and death. Those who possessed it held power in their communities. They became the first healers, the first practitioners of an art that combined observation, experimentation, and an intimate relationship with the natural world. We might call them shamans, medicine people, or herbalists. but their role was universal across human cultures. They were the keepers of botanical knowledge, the interpreters of what plants could offer. As humans developed language, this wisdom could be shared more precisely. Plant lore became embedded in oral traditions, passed from experienced healers to apprentices who would memorize vast catalogues of information. Which plants grew where, when to harvest them, how to prepare them, which ailments they might address. The songs and stories that helped preserve this knowledge across generations. Archaeological evidence gives us glimpses into these ancient practices. At burial sites dating back thousands of years, researchers have found medicinal plants placed alongside the dead. In prehistoric settlements, they have discovered residues of healing herbs in ancient pottery. In frozen remains preserved in ice, they have found medicine pouches containing carefully selected plants. One of the most remarkable discoveries came from the Italian Alps, where hikers in 1991 stumbled upon a body emerging from a melting glacier. The man, who lived approximately 5,000 years ago and is now known as Ötzi the Iceman, carried with him equipment that revealed much about ancient life. Among his possessions were 2 pieces of a birch fungus known to have antibacterial properties and to be effective against intestinal parasites. Analysis of his remains showed he suffered from various ailments that these fungi might have helped address. Here was direct evidence of deliberate medicinal plant use in prehistoric Europe. The transition from purely instinctive use of plants to something more systematic marked a crucial development in human history. Our ancestors began not merely to use plants reactively when illness struck, but to prepare and store them, to cultivate certain species near their settlements, to trade them across distances. Medicinal plants became valuable commodities, worth carrying on long journeys, worth protecting and cultivating. Different environments offer different botanical pharmacies. In tropical forests, the sheer diversity of plant species meant that indigenous peoples developed knowledge of hundreds or even thousands of medicinal plants. In Arctic regions, where plant diversity was limited, people learned to maximize the potential of each species, discovering multiple uses for hardy plants that could survive harsh conditions. In desert environments, communities developed expertise with succulents and drought-resistant plants that concentrated potent compounds in their tissues. Each landscape shaped the healing traditions that emerged from it, creating distinct regional approaches to botanical medicine. Yet remarkably, when we examine these separate traditions, we find overlaps. Different cultures on different continents, with no contact between them, independently discovered similar uses for similar plants. This convergent knowledge suggests something fundamental about the relationship between human biology and plant chemistry. Certain plants truly do possess properties that interact beneficially with our bodies. As human societies grew more complex, so did their use of medicinal plants. The earliest healers were generalists, knowing something of wounds, fevers, childbirth, and spiritual matters all at once. But gradually, specialization emerged. Some healers focused on specific types of ailments. Others became expert in particular classes of plants. Knowledge deepened and branched, creating increasingly sophisticated systems of botanical medicine. The stage was being set for the next great leap forward, the moment when this accumulated wisdom would be captured, not just in memory and oral tradition, but in permanent written form. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where agriculture had given rise to the world's first cities, scribes were about to inscribe humanity's earliest medical prescriptions into clay tablets that would survive for millennia. As the first great civilizations emerged along the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something remarkable was taking shape in the ancient land we now call Mesopotamia. Between approximately 4,000 and 2,000 years before the Common Era, the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians were not merely building cities and developing writing. They were also creating the world's first recorded medical system, complete with detailed instructions for preparing plant-based remedies. Picture, if you will, a Sumerian scribe sitting in the cool shade of a temple courtyard, carefully pressing a wedge-shaped stylus into soft clay. The year is approximately 2100 BCE, and this scribe is recording something precious, medical knowledge that has been passed down through generations. These clay tablets, baked hard by time and the hot Mesopotamian sun, would survive millennia to tell us their secrets. They represent humanity's earliest written evidence of organized herbal medicine, predating other known medical texts by hundreds of years. The most famous of these ancient documents is a single clay tablet discovered in the city of Nippur, dating to around 2100 BCE. This remarkable artifact contains descriptions of approximately 15 different remedies, using minerals and botanical materials in carefully prescribed combinations. The scribe who created this tablet wrote in Sumerian, using the distinctive cuneiform script that characterized this early writing system. What makes this tablet so extraordinary is not merely its age, but the sophistication it reveals. These were not simple folk remedies hastily noted down. They were formulations that showed a deep understanding of how to prepare and combine different substances for maximum therapeutic effect. The ancient Mesopotamians documented their use of numerous plants that might surprise us with their familiarity. They worked with thyme, bringing its aromatic leaves into their healing preparations. They understood the properties of mustard, that sharp and pungent plant whose seeds could stimulate and warm. They harvested the milky sap of poppies, though their understanding of its powerful properties was different from our modern knowledge of opium's chemistry. Myrrh, that fragrant resin from Arabia, made its way into their pharmacopoeia, valued for its preservative and healing qualities. These early physician scribes also worked with plants that might be less familiar to us today. They used a substance called turtle plant, though the exact botanical identity remains uncertain to modern scholars. They prepared remedies from something they called plant of the eagle, again presenting a delightful mystery for contemporary researchers attempting to match ancient names with modern botanical classifications. This linguistic puzzle reminds us that we are reaching across an enormous gulf of time, attempting to understand not just what these ancient healers knew, but how they thought about the natural world. The methods of preparation described on these tablets reveal considerable sophistication. Mesopotamian herbalists did not simply pluck plants and use them directly. They ground materials into fine powders using mortars and pestles. They created infusions by soaking plant materials in water or wine. They mixed their herbal preparations with substances like beer, which was a staple beverage in ancient Mesopotamia. and served as an excellent solvent for extracting plant compounds. They combined their remedies with oils and fats to create salves and ointments that could be applied to the skin. Some preparations were designed to be taken internally, while others were meant for external application to wounds or painful areas. What particularly distinguished Mesopotamian herbal medicine was its association with both the natural and the supernatural. These ancient healers inhabited a worldview where illness could have both physical and spiritual causes. Their medical tablets often combined herbal prescriptions with incantations and rituals. A healer might prepare a poultice of specific plants while simultaneously reciting prayers to the goddess Gula, the great physician deity of the Mesopotamian pantheon. This integration of practical treatment and spiritual practice was not superstition replacing medicine, but rather a holistic approach that addressed what they perceived as the multiple dimensions of illness. Later, Babylonian medical texts, dating from around 1000 BCE, expanded considerably on earlier Sumerian knowledge. These documents listed hundreds of medicinal plants, creating what amounted to extensive pharmacological catalogues. The Babylonians organized their knowledge systematically, often grouping remedies by the conditions they treated or by the parts of the body they affected. This organizational impulse represents an important step in medical thinking, moving toward classification and systematic understanding rather than simply collecting disparate remedies. The Babylonians worked with cassia and cinnamon, those warm spices from distant lands that entered Mesopotamia through extensive trade networks. They used cedar, which grew in the mountains to the north, for its aromatic and preservative properties. They prepared remedies from licorice root, that sweet substance that has remained in medical use across millennia. They understood the properties of garlic and applied it to various ailments, recognizing in their own way what modern science would later confirm: that this pungent bulb possesses genuine antimicrobial properties. The transmission of medical knowledge in Mesopotamian society was carefully controlled. Medical texts were primarily the province of educated scribes and physicians, individuals who had undergone years of training to master the complex cuneiform writing system and the extensive body of medical knowledge. These professionals often belonged to established medical families, passing their knowledge from father to son across generations. The therapeutic arts were considered prestigious and important work, and those who practiced them held respected positions in society. Trade routes radiating out from Mesopotamian cities brought exotic botanicals from distant regions. Merchants traveling by caravan from India, Arabia, and Persia carried precious plant materials, resins, barks, roots, and seeds that local healers incorporated into their remedies. This early international trade in medicinal plants established patterns that would continue for thousands of years, with valuable healing substances traveling vast distances to reach those who needed them. As we drift now toward the banks of another great river system, we carry with us an image of those ancient clay tablets, their wedge-shaped characters preserving botanical wisdom across unfathomable expanses of time. The Mesopotamians gave us more than just lists of plants and preparations. They gave us the first written evidence that humans were thinking systematically about plant medicine, organizing knowledge, and attempting to create reliable therapeutic approaches. Their green pharmacy, pressed into clay beneath the bright Mesopotamian sun, laid foundations that would influence medical practice across the ancient world and down through the centuries to our own time. As we journey downstream along the Nile, leaving behind the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, we arrive in the ancient land of Egypt, where the desert sun illuminates one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. Here, along the fertile banks of this legendary river, a sophisticated tradition of herbal medicine flourished for thousands of years, leaving us with some of the most detailed records of plant-based healing the ancient world ever produced. The Egyptians possessed a deep reverence for the natural world, and this extended profoundly to their understanding of medicinal plants. They recognized that the same land, which provided their food and sustenance, also offered relief from suffering and disease. Walk with me now through the gardens and temple complexes of ancient Egypt, where physicians carefully tended their healing herbs under the watchful gaze of both sun and stars. Our most remarkable window into Egyptian herbal medicine comes from a document known as the Ebers Papyrus, named after Georg Ebers, the German Egyptologist who acquired it in 1873. This extraordinary manuscript, dating to approximately 1550 BCE, stretches over 20 meters in length when unrolled. Imagine the careful hands that prepared the papyrus, the steady fingers that mixed the ink, and the practiced scribes who recorded this precious knowledge in flowing hieratic script. Within its columns lie over 800 remedies, drawing upon more than 700 different substances, with plants forming the foundation of this ancient pharmacopoeia. The Ebers Papyrus reads almost like a conversation across millennia, offering treatments for conditions ranging from wounds and burns to digestive complaints and skin disorders. The Egyptian physicians who compiled this knowledge didn't simply list plants. They provided detailed instructions for preparation, describing how to grind, mix, heat, and apply their remedies. They understood that the same plant might be used differently depending on the ailment, and that careful preparation was essential to effectiveness. Among the many plants the Egyptians treasured, aloe held a particularly special place. This succulent plant, with its thick, gel-filled leaves, was valued for treating burns and skin conditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that aloe was cultivated in Egyptian gardens, specifically for medicinal purposes. The cooling gel inside the leaves provided immediate relief, and Egyptian physicians observed its ability to promote healing. Cleopatra herself was said to have used aloe as part of her beauty regimen, though this detail drifts into the realm of legend rather than documented fact. Frankincense and myrrh, those precious resins familiar to us from ancient tales, were far more than ceremonial incenses in Egyptian medicine. These aromatic substances, imported from Arabia and the Horn of Africa through extensive trade networks, were incorporated into numerous healing preparations. Frankincense was used in fumigations and believed to have purifying properties, while myrrh found its way into wound treatments and preparations for various internal complaints. The Egyptians recognized something modern research has confirmed. These resins possess genuine antimicrobial properties. The castor plant, which the Greeks would later name Ricinus communis, was well known to Egyptian physicians. They extracted oil from its seeds and used it primarily as a laxative, though they also incorporated it into preparations for skin conditions. The Ebers Papyrus mentions castor oil in multiple remedies, testament to its importance in their medical practice. Garlic, that humble and pungent bulb, appears frequently in Egyptian medical texts and was clearly valued both as food and medicine. Workers building the pyramids received regular rations of garlic, and while this practice served nutritional purposes, the Egyptians also recognized garlic's strengthening properties. They used it in various preparations and understood it to be beneficial for overall health and vitality. The opium poppy makes its appearance in Egyptian medicine as well, though the documentation is less extensive than for other plants. Evidence suggests that Egyptians were aware of opium's pain-relieving properties, having likely learned of this plant through their contacts with Eastern Mediterranean regions. The careful cultivation and use of this powerful plant demonstrates the sophistication of Egyptian medical knowledge and their understanding that some remedies required particular caution. Egyptian physicians also worked extensively with juniper, using its berries and oil in treatments for digestive complaints, and as a component in purification rituals that blended medical practice with spiritual belief. Coriander seeds appear in numerous remedies, as does fennel, both plants that the Egyptians cultivated in their gardens. The line between culinary herbs and medicinal plants was delightfully blurred, as it remains in many healing traditions today. The preservation techniques for which Egypt is justly famous extended to their medicinal plants. In the tombs of pharaohs and nobles, archaeologists have discovered carefully wrapped bundles of herbs, placed there to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. These botanical time capsules have allowed modern researchers to identify with certainty which plants the Egyptians valued most highly. In Tutankhamun's tomb, among the golden treasures, lay humble garlands of flowers and packets of seeds, including coriander and watermelon, testimony to the Egyptian belief in plants' enduring importance. The preparation of remedies in ancient Egypt involved careful attention to detail. Plants were dried in the desert sun, ground using stone mortars and pestles, mixed with oils or fats to create ointments, or steeped in wine or beer to extract their beneficial properties. Egyptian physicians understood that different preparation methods suited different plants and purposes. They created poultices by mixing ground plant material with honey or animal fats, and they prepared infusions by steeping herbs in hot water, methods that remain familiar to herbalists today. Honey itself deserves special mention in the Egyptian herbal tradition. This golden substance appears throughout their medical texts, used both as a healing agent in its own right and as a base for incorporating other plant medicines. The Egyptians recognized honey's ability to prevent infection and promote wound healing, properties modern science attributes to its antimicrobial nature and its creation of a protective barrier over damaged tissue. The role of Egyptian physicians, the SWNW as they were called, encompassed both practical and spiritual dimensions. These healers studied extensively, learning the properties of plants and the appropriate incantations that often accompanied treatment. While we might smile at the notion of combining herbal remedies with magical spells, this integration reflected the Egyptian worldview that saw body and spirit as inseparable and healing as addressing the whole person. Egyptian medical knowledge didn't remain confined within the borders of the Nile Valley. Through trade and cultural exchange, their understanding of medicinal plants spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Greek physicians, including those who would later shape Western medical tradition, acknowledged their debt to Egyptian herbal wisdom. This transmission of knowledge represents one of many threads connecting ancient healing traditions across time and geography. As the centuries unfolded along the Nile, Egyptian herbal medicine continued to develop and refine, accumulating wisdom through countless generations of careful observation and practice. The plants that grew in temple gardens and were traded across desert routes carried within them the hopes of countless individuals seeking relief from suffering. Now, as our journey through ancient Egypt draws to a close, we prepare to turn our attention eastward toward the vast lands of China, where another great tradition of herbal medicine was taking root, developing its own unique philosophy and approach to plant-based healing. As we turn our gaze eastward from the lands of the pharaohs, we find ourselves in another ancient civilization, where the relationship between plants and healing was developing along a distinctly different path. While Egyptian physicians were recording their remedies on papyrus, healers in China were cultivating their own profound understanding of botanical medicine, one that would shape healing practices across Asia for thousands of years to come. The origins of Chinese herbal medicine drift back through layers of history and legend until they become almost indistinguishable from myth. According to tradition, the knowledge began with the three sovereigns, legendary rulers said to have lived nearly 5,000 years ago. Among these was Shennong, whose name means divine farmer. He is remembered as a figure with extraordinary dedication to understanding the natural world, particularly the plants that grew across the varied landscapes of ancient China. The stories tell of how Shennong personally tasted hundreds of plants, experiencing their effects firsthand to determine which could nourish and which could heal. Legend suggests he had a transparent abdomen, allowing him to observe how different plants affected his body's internal workings. While this detail belongs to the realm of mythology, it speaks to something very real: the systematic, careful observation that Chinese herbalists applied to their craft. Like healers in other ancient cultures, they learned through patient trial and attentive watching, gradually building a body of knowledge passed down through generations. By the time we reach documented history, Chinese medicine had already developed into a sophisticated system with its own unique philosophy. Unlike the approaches we've encountered in Mesopotamia and Egypt, Chinese medicine viewed the body as a landscape of flowing energies and delicate balances. Health was understood not merely as the absence of disease, but as a state of harmony between opposing yet complementary forces. This philosophical foundation shaped how Chinese physicians thought about medicinal plants. Each herb was believed to possess particular qualities that could influence the body's internal balance. Some plants were considered warming, others cooling. Some moved energy upward, others downward. The art of herbal medicine lay not simply in knowing which plant treated which ailment, but in understanding how to combine plants in formulas that would restore the body's natural equilibrium. Around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, this accumulated wisdom found its way into written form in a text called the Shennong Ben Kaojing, or the Divine Farmer's Classic of Materia Medica. Though attributed to the legendary Shennong, it was actually compiled by unknown authors who gathered together centuries of herbal knowledge. This pharmacopoeia described 365 medicinal substances, the majority of them plants, though it also included some mineral and animal materials. The text organized these substances into 3 categories based on their properties and uses. The superior class contained substances considered nourishing and essentially harmless, plants that could be taken regularly to maintain health and promote longevity. These included herbs like ginseng, whose gnarled roots were prized for their energizing properties, and licorice root, which appeared in countless formulas for its harmonizing effects. The middle class comprised plants with more specific therapeutic actions, substances that could treat particular imbalances, but required more careful use. The inferior class included powerful substances reserved for treating serious conditions, plants whose potent effects demanded respect and expertise. This classification system reflected a sophisticated understanding that plants existed along a spectrum from gentle tonics to powerful medicines. Among the herbs described in this ancient text were plants that remain central to Chinese medicine today. There was dang gui, known elsewhere as angelica, valued for nourishing blood and supporting women's health. There was huang qi, or astragalus, used to strengthen what Chinese physicians called defensive energy. Ma huang, the plant known as ephedra, was recognized for its ability to open breathing passages and warm the body. The text also included preparation methods that showed considerable practical sophistication. Herbs might be used fresh or dried, raw or processed through various techniques. Some were decocted by boiling in water, others were ground into powders, and still others were prepared as wines or pills. The method of preparation could alter a plant's properties and effects, adding another layer of refinement to the herbalist's art. As centuries passed, Chinese herbal medicine continued to evolve and expand. During the Han Dynasty, physicians began writing detailed case studies and theoretical treatises. By the Tang Dynasty, the government had established medical schools and standardized herbal formulas. The body of knowledge grew ever larger, preserved in texts that were copied and recopied, studied and commented upon by successive generations of scholars and physicians. What makes the Chinese herbal tradition particularly remarkable is its continuity. While the herbal knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia became fragmented, and that of Egypt was eventually overshadowed by Greco-Roman medicine, Chinese herbal medicine maintained an unbroken lineage of practice and scholarship. Formulas created over 1,000 years ago are still prescribed today, their uses refined through countless clinical applications across the centuries. The philosophy underlying Chinese herbal medicine also influenced how it spread to neighboring cultures. Korea, Japan, and Vietnam all developed their own variations on Chinese medical theory, adapting the herbs and formulas to their local plants and cultural contexts, while maintaining the fundamental principles of energetic balance and harmony. The herbs themselves traveled along trade routes, carried by merchants alongside silk and spices. Some plants native to China found their way to distant lands, while foreign botanicals were incorporated into the Chinese pharmacopoeia. This exchange enriched the tradition, even as its core principles remained remarkably stable. In quiet apothecaries throughout ancient China, drawers and jars held carefully preserved herbs, their fragrances mingling in the air. Skilled physicians would select combinations tailored to each patient's unique pattern of imbalance, writing prescriptions that might include a dozen or more ingredients. These formulas were seen not as collections of individual drugs, but as carefully orchestrated compositions, each herb playing its role like an instrument in an ensemble. As we prepare to journey next to India, where another great tradition of herbal healing was flowering, we carry with us this vision of Chinese medicine, a system that saw plants not merely as sources of chemical compounds, but as participants in the delicate dance of energies that constituted health and life itself. This different way of understanding botanical healing would persist through millennia, offering an alternative perspective on the ancient human quest to harness the healing power of the plant world. As the knowledge of herbal medicine flourished across ancient China, another great civilization was developing its own profound understanding of healing plants. In the vast subcontinent of India, a medical tradition was taking shape that would become one of the world's most comprehensive and enduring systems of natural healing. This tradition, known as Ayurveda, meaning the science of life, emerged from the mists of antiquity to create a framework for understanding health and wellness that continues to influence millions of lives today. The origins of Ayurvedic medicine stretch back more than 5,000 years, woven into the very fabric of ancient Indian culture. According to tradition, this knowledge was not discovered through trial and error alone, but was considered a gift passed down through generations of wise healers and seers. These early practitioners observed the natural world with extraordinary attention, noting how plants grew, how animals instinctively sought certain herbs when ill, and how the human body responded to different botanical preparations. In the stillness of meditation, and through careful empirical observation, they developed a sophisticated understanding of how plants could restore balance and promote healing. The sacred texts that preserved this ancient wisdom are among humanity's oldest medical writings. The Karaka Samhita, compiled around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, but based on much older oral traditions, stands as one of Ayurveda's foundational texts. This remarkable document contains detailed descriptions of hundreds of medicinal plants, along with precise instructions for their preparation and use. Reading through its pages is like stepping into an ancient healing garden, where each plant has been studied not just for its physical properties, but for its subtle effects on the body's inner energies and rhythms. Another essential text, the Sushruta Samhita, complemented this knowledge with additional botanical wisdom and practical applications. Together, these writings catalogued an astonishing pharmacopoeia of natural remedies, drawing from India's rich biodiversity of tropical forests, mountain slopes, and river valleys. The text described not merely the plants themselves, but the optimal times for harvesting, the parts to be used, the methods of preparation, and the specific conditions each remedy was meant to address. What made Ayurvedic herbalism particularly sophisticated was its holistic framework for understanding health and disease. The ancient Ayurvedic physicians developed the concept of 3 fundamental energies, or doshas, known as Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, believed to govern different aspects of bodily function. Each person was understood to have a unique constitution, a particular balance of these energies that determined their physical characteristics, mental tendencies, and susceptibility to various ailments. Illness was seen as an imbalance of these fundamental forces, and healing plants were selected not just to treat symptoms, but to restore the body's natural equilibrium. This personalized approach to medicine meant that the same herb might be prescribed differently for different individuals, depending on their constitution and the nature of their imbalance. An herbalist would consider the plant's taste, its heating or cooling properties, its moisture or dryness, and its effects on the various tissues and systems of the body. The preparation methods, too, were remarkably varied, including decoctions simmered for hours, fresh juices, powders mixed with honey or ghee, medicated oils for massage, and complex formulations combining dozens of ingredients. Among the hundreds of plants central to Ayurvedic practice, certain herbs achieved special prominence. Turmeric, that golden-hued root now found in kitchens worldwide, was treasured not only as a spice, but as a powerful healing agent, applied to wounds and taken internally for a host of conditions. The neem tree, with its bitter leaves and seeds, was considered nearly miraculous in its applications, used for everything from dental care to skin conditions. Ashwagandha, a small shrub with plump red berries, was valued as a rejuvenating tonic, believed to strengthen the body and calm the mind. The sacred tulsi plant, also known as holy basil, held both medicinal and spiritual significance, often grown in courtyards and temple gardens. Brahmi, a delicate creeping herb found in wetlands, was particularly prized for its effects on mental clarity and memory. Triphala, a combination of 3 dried fruits, became one of Ayurveda's most versatile formulations, used to support digestion and elimination while gently nourishing the tissues. The knowledge of these plants and countless others was passed down through carefully structured teaching traditions. Students of Ayurveda would spend years learning directly from master physicians, not merely memorizing lists of herbs and their uses, but developing a deep understanding of the principles underlying their application. They would walk through forests and fields, learning to identify plants in their natural habitats, understanding their relationships with the seasons, the soil, and the surrounding ecosystem. The preparation of Ayurvedic remedies was considered almost an art form, requiring patience, precision, and respect for the plant's inherent qualities. Some formulations required months of careful processing, with ingredients being combined in specific sequences, heated or cooled according to exacting specifications, and stored in particular types of containers. The most complex preparations, known as rasayanas, were rejuvenating compounds that might include rare herbs, minerals, and other substances, prepared through elaborate multi-step processes designed to enhance their potency and remove any harmful properties. As Ayurvedic medicine matured over the centuries, it developed specialized branches addressing different aspects of health. There were herbalists who focused on general medicine, others who specialized in surgical applications, and still others who concentrated on rejuvenation therapies or pediatric care. Throughout all these specializations, plants remained the primary tools of healing, with the vast Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia offering remedies for nearly every conceivable ailment. The tradition also recognized that healing extended beyond the physical. Many Ayurvedic herbs were valued for their effects on mental and emotional well-being, their ability to promote restful sleep, enhance meditation, or bring clarity to troubled thoughts. This understanding of plants as medicines for the whole person, addressing body, mind, and spirit together, gave Ayurvedic herbalism a depth that continues to resonate with seekers of natural healing today. As the ancient world progressed, the knowledge preserved in these Indian traditions would eventually spread along trade routes, influencing medical practices in neighboring regions and beyond. But within India itself, Ayurveda remained a living tradition, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining its core principles and its profound respect for the healing power of plants. The gardens where these herbs grew, the texts that described their uses, and the lineages of healers who preserved this wisdom all contributed to a system of botanical medicine that stands as one of humanity's great achievements in understanding the relationship between plants and health. As the sun rose over the Aegean Sea, illuminating the white marble temples and bustling marketplaces of ancient Greece, a new approach to healing was taking shape. Where earlier civilizations had often attributed illness to the whims of gods or supernatural forces, Greek thinkers began to observe the natural world with fresh eyes, seeking patterns and principles that could explain both disease and health. This shift in perspective would transform how humanity understood medicinal plants for centuries to come. The story of Greek herbal medicine begins in the 5th century before the Common Era on the small island of Kos. Here lived a physician whose name would become synonymous with medicine itself. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, established a school of healing that emphasized careful observation, detailed record-keeping, and the healing power of nature. He and his followers documented their treatments with remarkable precision, creating case studies that described not just what remedies they used, but how patients responded over time. The Hippocratic physicians worked with hundreds of plant remedies, each selected according to their understanding of how the body functioned. They used willow bark and leaves to reduce fever, recognizing their cooling properties long before anyone understood the anti-inflammatory compounds within. They prescribed hellebore for purging, sage for wounds, and garlic for strength and endurance. Their writings reveal a thoughtful, systematic approach to herbal medicine, one that sought to support the body's own healing capacity rather than simply attack disease. What made the Greek approach distinctive was their attempt to understand why plants worked, not merely that they did. They developed theories about the body's humors and qualities, believing that health depended on maintaining proper balance. Plants were classified according to their properties, whether heating or cooling, drying or moistening. A skilled physician would select herbs to counteract whatever imbalance they believed caused the illness. While their underlying theory differed from modern understanding, their careful observation of plant effects laid groundwork for systematic herbalism. Another figure emerged who would shape botanical knowledge in a different but equally important way. Theophrastus, a student of the great philosopher Aristotle, turned his attention to plants themselves. Around 300 BCE, he composed 2 remarkable works that examined the plant kingdom with unprecedented detail. His Inquiry into Plants and On the Causes of Plants described hundreds of species, their growth patterns, their preferred habitats, and their various uses. Theophrastus walked through gardens and wild places, noting which plants thrived in shade and which demanded sun, which needed abundant water, and which tolerated drought. He described root systems, flowering times, and seed dispersal. When he wrote about medicinal plants, he included practical details about harvesting and preparation. His work represented something new, botany as a science in its own right, distinct from medicine, yet essential to it. A physician needed to understand plants as living things, not merely as ingredients in remedies. The Greeks established another innovation that would prove crucial for herbal medicine: the organized medicinal garden. While earlier cultures had certainly cultivated healing plants, Greek physicians created dedicated spaces for growing, studying, and teaching about medicinal herbs. These gardens served as living libraries where students could learn to identify plants at different stages of growth, understanding how a spring seedling would transform into summer's flowering herb. In these gardens and in the wild places of Greece, physicians gathered their materia medica. They collected leaves of mint and thyme from mountain slopes, their aromatic oils strongest under the Mediterranean sun. They harvested opium poppy sap with careful cuts to the seed capsules, knowing its powerful ability to ease pain and promote sleep. They dug roots of plants like iris and gentian, timing their harvest to when potency peaked. Each plant demanded different knowledge: when to gather, which parts to use, how to prepare and preserve them. Greek herbalism spread wherever Greek culture reached. When Alexander the Great led his armies across vast territories, physicians and botanists traveled with them, encountering new plants and comparing them with familiar ones. They documented what they found, sending seeds and specimens back home, enriching Greek botanical knowledge with discoveries from distant lands. This exchange transformed Greek herbalism from a regional practice into something more cosmopolitan, incorporating wisdom from Persia, Egypt, and beyond. The Greeks also began to standardize preparations. They developed specific methods for making infusions and decoctions, for creating poultices and salves. They experimented with preserving herbs in wine, vinegar, and honey, finding ways to extract and stabilize plant compounds. These pharmaceutical techniques allowed remedies to be stored, transported, and administered with greater consistency than ever before. As centuries passed, Greek medical knowledge accumulated in the great libraries, particularly in Alexandria, where Greek culture blended with Egyptian traditions. Physicians there had access to texts from multiple civilizations, allowing them to compare different approaches to the same healing plants. They could read what Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Greek physicians had written about garlic or castor oil, synthesizing centuries of accumulated experience. The Greek approach to herbal medicine emphasized education and apprenticeship. Young physicians learned by accompanying experienced healers, watching how they selected and prepared remedies, how they adjusted treatments based on patient response. They studied texts, but also developed practical skills: how to powder dried herbs, how to judge the quality of plant materials, how to combine ingredients for specific effects. This hands-on training ensured that knowledge passed from generation to generation, refined by continuous practice. Greek herbalists recognized that plants could both heal and harm. They understood that dosage mattered, that the difference between medicine and poison often lay in amount rather than substance. This awareness made them careful practitioners, starting with small doses and observing effects before increasing amounts. They documented adverse reactions alongside beneficial ones, building a more complete picture of each plant's properties. By the time the Roman Empire began to dominate the Mediterranean world, Greek herbal medicine had developed into a sophisticated system. It combined centuries of observation with theoretical frameworks, practical techniques with written documentation. The Greeks had taken the scattered plant knowledge of earlier peoples and woven it into something more organized and teachable. They had created texts that could preserve and transmit this knowledge across time and distance. Their greatest contribution, perhaps, was this spirit of systematic inquiry, the belief that careful observation and logical thinking could unlock nature's healing secrets. This approach would flow forward through the centuries, carried by the physicians and texts that followed, including one extraordinary military doctor whose comprehensive Herbal would become the most influential botanical text the ancient world would ever know. As the wisdom of Greek physicians spread throughout the ancient world, one man would emerge to create the most comprehensive and enduring work on medicinal plants ever written in antiquity. His name was Pedanius Dioscorides, and his journey through the first century of the Common Era would produce a text so remarkable that physicians, herbalists, and healers would consult it for the next 1500 years. Dioscorides was born around 40 CE in the region of Cilicia, in what is now southern Turkey. Unlike many scholars of his time who spent their lives in libraries and academies, Dioscorides chose a path that would take him across the vast expanse of the Roman Empire. He served as a physician with the Roman army, a role that proved to be the perfect opportunity for a curious mind fascinated by the healing properties of plants. As the legions marched from the forests of Gaul to the deserts of North Africa, from the mountains of Iberia to the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, Dioscorides encountered an extraordinary variety of plant life and healing traditions. Imagine the dedication required for his task. In each new region, Dioscorides would seek out local healers, farmers, and herbalists. He would observe plants in their natural habitats, noting the seasons of their growth, the characteristics of their leaves and flowers, and the environments they preferred. He would carefully document how different peoples prepared remedies from these plants, whether they were crushed, boiled, dried, or mixed with other substances. He tested remedies himself and observed their effects on patients. This was not armchair scholarship, but fieldwork of the most meticulous kind, conducted over many years of travel. Around 70 CE, Dioscorides completed his masterwork, which he called De Materia Medica, or On Medical Materials. The text described over 600 plants, along with around 1,000 medicines derived from plant, animal, and mineral sources. But this was far more than a simple list. For each plant, Dioscorides provided detailed descriptions that would allow readers to identify the plant with confidence. He explained where each plant grew, what it looked like at different stages of growth, and which parts were used in medicine. Most importantly, he described in careful detail what each plant could be used to treat. The organization of De Materia Medica revealed Dioscorides' practical mind. Rather than arranging plants alphabetically or by their appearance, he grouped them by their properties and effects on the body. Plants that warmed were described together, as were those that cooled. Remedies for similar ailments appeared in proximity. This arrangement made the work especially useful for physicians seeking treatments for specific conditions. Consider some of the plants Dioscorides documented. He wrote extensively about opium poppy, describing how its sap could ease pain and induce sleep, while warning of the dangers of excessive use. He detailed the properties of willow, whose bark contained substances that would one day inspire the creation of aspirin. He described aloe, which Egyptian physicians had used for millennia, and explained its applications for healing wounds and soothing burns. Garlic, mint, chamomile, fennel, and hundreds of other plants found their place in his pages, each entry reflecting years of accumulated observation and testing. What made De Materia Medica particularly valuable was Dioscorides' critical approach. He included information about plants that were commonly used but noted when he was uncertain about their effectiveness. He warned about plants that could be dangerous if improperly prepared or dosed. He described methods for detecting adulterated or counterfeit herbs that unscrupulous merchants might try to sell. This careful, evidence-based approach gave his work an authority that transcended cultural boundaries. The influence of De Materia Medica spread rapidly across the ancient world. Greek physicians treasured it as an essential reference. When scholars translated it into Latin, it became foundational to Roman medicine. Later, Arabic scholars would translate it as well, preserving and transmitting Dioscorides' knowledge through the medieval period. Byzantine physicians created beautifully illustrated manuscripts of the text, adding paintings of plants to help with identification. One of these manuscripts, created around 512 CE for Juliana Anicia, a Roman noblewoman, survives to this day and represents one of the oldest illuminated scientific texts in existence. Throughout the medieval period and into the Renaissance, physicians across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa consulted Dioscorides whenever they encountered an unfamiliar plant or needed guidance on preparing a remedy. His descriptions were copied and recopied by hand through the centuries. Commentaries were added, expanding on his observations with new discoveries. Yet the core text remained remarkably consistent, a testament to the thoroughness of his original work. The longevity of De Materia Medica as the primary reference for medicinal plants is extraordinary when you consider how much the world changed between the 1st century and the 16th century. Empires rose and fell. Religions spread and transformed societies. Languages evolved and merged. Yet physicians separated by 1,000 years of history could open Dioscorides' text and find guidance that remained relevant and useful. A Byzantine doctor in Constantinople, an Islamic physician in Baghdad, and a medieval monk in a European monastery all looked to the same source for their knowledge of healing plants. Dioscorides succeeded in creating such an enduring work because he combined direct observation with systematic documentation. He did not simply repeat what others had told him or rely on theoretical frameworks divorced from practice. Instead, he built his knowledge plant by plant, remedy by remedy, through personal investigation. His military service, while perhaps an unusual background for a medical authority, gave him access to a geographic and cultural breadth that few scholars could match. The Roman Empire's vast extent became his laboratory, and its diverse peoples his teachers. As evening deepens, and we consider the legacy of this remarkable physician, we might reflect on how knowledge travels across time. Dioscorides could never have imagined that his careful notes, written on papyrus or parchment by lamplight in a military camp or a rented room, would still be read 15 centuries later. Yet the care he took in his observations, the clarity of his descriptions, and the practical usefulness of his information ensured that his work would transcend the era in which it was created. In gardens and apothecaries, in monasteries and universities, wherever people sought to understand the healing power of plants, the name of Dioscorides was honored as the great teacher, the careful observer, the physician who walked the empire and wrote down what he learned, creating a bridge between ancient wisdom and future knowledge that would stand the test of millennia. As Dioscorides' great herbal work spread throughout the Mediterranean world, it found perhaps its most eager audience within the growing Roman Empire. The Romans, practical and methodical in their approach to nearly everything, embraced the organized knowledge of medicinal plants with characteristic enthusiasm. They transformed herbal medicine from a collection of remedies into a systematic practice, supported by an infrastructure that would carry botanical knowledge across 3 continents. The Romans were builders of networks, not just of roads and aqueducts, but of information and resources. As their legions marched across Europe, North Africa, and into Asia, they encountered countless new plants and healing traditions. Each conquered territory offered its botanical treasures, and Roman physicians eagerly documented these discoveries. The empire became a living laboratory for herbal experimentation, where remedies from Britannia could be tested alongside treatments from Syria, and where Egyptian preparations might be refined using Greek methodology. In the heart of Rome itself, ambitious citizens cultivated elaborate gardens dedicated to medicinal plants. These weren't merely decorative spaces, though they certainly possessed beauty. They were practical repositories of healing knowledge, carefully organized collections where specific plants were grown for their therapeutic properties. Wealthy Romans took pride in their Horti Medici, demonstrating both their sophistication and their commitment to health. The gardens featured raised beds where delicate species could be tended with precision, irrigation systems that ensured proper moisture, and careful arrangements that grouped plants according to their uses or growing requirements. Antonius Musa, physician to Emperor Augustus, elevated the status of herbal medicine within Roman society through his successful treatments of the emperor himself. When Augustus suffered from a dangerous illness, Musa departed from conventional warm treatments and prescribed cold baths, along with preparations made from herbs. The emperor's recovery brought tremendous prestige to botanical medicine, and suddenly, gardens of medicinal plants became fashionable throughout Rome. Citizens who had never given much thought to herbs now consulted with gardeners about establishing their own collections. The practical Romans didn't simply grow these plants for emergency use. They incorporated herbal remedies into daily life, creating a culture of preventive medicine that would have impressed even the Greek physicians who preceded them. Morning routines might include herbal preparations to aid digestion. Bathhouses, those beloved Roman institutions, featured rooms where aromatic herbs were burned or scattered, filling the air with therapeutic vapors. Massage oils were infused with plant extracts chosen for their specific properties, whether to soothe tired muscles or invigorate the skin. The Roman military, that extraordinary machine of organization and discipline, maintained its own system of herbal medicine. Legion physicians carried supplies of dried herbs and prepared remedies, knowing that wounded or sick soldiers far from home would need treatment. Military hospitals established throughout the empire cultivated gardens nearby, ensuring fresh supplies of essential medicinal plants. Archaeological excavations of these hospital sites have revealed the remains of specific species, giving us glimpses into which plants Roman military physicians considered most crucial for their work. Perhaps nothing demonstrates Roman practicality more clearly than their establishment of trade routes specifically designed to transport medicinal plants and preparations. Ships arrived at Rome's port of Ostia, carrying not just grain and olive oil, but carefully packed bundles of herbs from distant provinces. Frankincense and myrrh traveled from Arabia. Silphium, prized for its numerous medicinal applications, came from North Africa until the plant was harvested to extinction. One of history's first documented cases of a medicinal plant disappearing due to overuse. Black pepper, valued both as spice and medicine, made the long journey from India, becoming so precious that it was sometimes used as currency. These trade networks operated with remarkable sophistication. Merchants specialized in botanical goods, developing expertise in how to properly harvest, dry, and transport plants so they would arrive in usable condition. Written records from the period mention prices for various herbs, quality grades, and preferred suppliers. The Romans understood that a medicinal plant poorly preserved lost its effectiveness, so techniques for maintaining potency during long voyages became valuable knowledge in themselves. In Rome's bustling markets, shops dedicated to herbal preparations served customers seeking remedies for everyday ailments. These weren't the mysterious quarters of magicians or conjurers, but respectable establishments where knowledgeable practitioners prepared medicines according to established methods. The proprietors consulted texts, measured ingredients carefully, and built reputations based on the quality and consistency of their preparations. Customers could describe their symptoms and receive formulations tailored to their specific needs, often combining several plants according to principles learned from Greek and Egyptian predecessors. The Romans also contributed to herbal medicine through their careful observation and record-keeping. Pliny the Elder, that indefatigable compiler of knowledge, devoted substantial portions of his natural history to medicinal plants. Writing in the 1st century, he documented hundreds of species and their applications, drawing on both written sources and personal inquiry. While modern readers might smile at some of his more optimistic claims, Pliny's work preserved valuable information about how Romans actually used plants in daily medical practice. His writings captured not just elite medical theory, but folk practices and common remedies, giving us a fuller picture of Roman herbal medicine. As Roman influence extended into new territories, local populations often found their traditional plant knowledge intersecting with Roman practices. In Britannia, native healers' use of plants like feverfew and yarrow caught Roman attention. In Gaul, local herbs were incorporated into Roman medical practice. This wasn't simply one-directional cultural transfer. The Romans, for all their confidence, recognized effective remedies regardless of origin. Their empire became a vast exchange network where botanical knowledge flowed in multiple directions, enriching medical practice throughout the connected regions. The Roman passion for written documentation meant that much of this accumulated knowledge was preserved in texts that would survive the empire's eventual decline. Roman physicians continued the tradition established by Dioscorides, creating manuscripts that described plants, their properties, and proper preparation methods. These texts, copied and recopied, would carry Roman herbal knowledge forward through changing times, eventually finding their way into the hands of medieval monks who would become the next guardians of botanical medicine. As night settles over the ancient Roman gardens, we can imagine the scent of chamomile and lavender drifting on the evening air. Plants cultivated not just for fragrance, but for their calming properties. The Roman contribution to herbal medicine lay not in dramatic new theories, but in their methodical organization, their vast distribution networks, and their practical integration of plant remedies into everyday life. They transformed herbal medicine from local traditions into a widespread, systematic practice, building infrastructure that would influence healing arts for centuries to come. As the Roman Empire receded and the lights of classical civilization dimmed across Europe, the precious knowledge of herbal medicine found an unexpected sanctuary. Behind the thick stone walls of medieval monasteries, in carefully tended gardens and dimly lit scriptoriums, monks became the quiet guardians of botanical wisdom that might otherwise have been lost to the tumultuous centuries we now call the Dark Ages. Picture a monastery garden on a misty morning in the 8th century. The air is still and cool, carrying the mingled scents of lavender, sage, and rosemary. A monk in a rough woolen habit walks slowly along raised beds, checking the progress of his medicinal plants with the same devotion he brings to his prayers. This scene, repeated across thousands of monasteries from Ireland to Italy, from Spain to Germany, represented one of history's most important acts of preservation. The monasteries served multiple roles in medieval society, and among the most vital was their function as centers of healing. Each monastery maintained an infirmary where sick monks received care, and many opened their doors to local people seeking relief from illness. This practical need drove monks to cultivate extensive collections of healing plants and to study the ancient texts that describe their uses. The monastery garden followed a distinctive design that reflected both practical needs and spiritual symbolism. Typically divided into quadrants by paths forming a cross, these gardens organized plants according to their purposes. The physic garden, dedicated to medicinal herbs, occupied a prominent position. Here grew the essential remedies of medieval medicine: peppermint for digestive troubles, fever-few for headaches, chamomile for calming nerves, comfrey for wounds, and dozens of other carefully tended plants. Monks approached their gardens with remarkable dedication and systematic care. They understood that the potency of medicinal plants depended on proper cultivation, harvesting at the right time, and correct preparation. They noted which plants thrived in sun or shade, which preferred damp soil or dry, and when each should be gathered for maximum effect. This knowledge, accumulated through generations of careful observation, was meticulously recorded in manuscripts that circulated among monasteries. One of the most famous of these manuscripts was the Plan of St. Gall, created around the year 820 in what is now Switzerland. This extraordinary document, which survives to this day, shows the ideal layout for a monastery and includes detailed gardens. The physic garden depicted in this plan contained 16 beds, each designated for specific medicinal plants. The precision of this planning reveals how seriously monasteries took their role as keepers of herbal knowledge. The monastic tradition of copying manuscripts played an essential role in preserving ancient wisdom. In the scriptoriums, patient scribes spent countless hours reproducing texts by Dioscorides, Galen, and other classical authorities. These Latin manuscripts, illustrated with careful drawings of plants, became treasured resources. Each copy represented months or even years of painstaking work. Yet this labor ensured that knowledge spanning centuries and continents remained accessible. Among the most influential figures in monastic herbalism was Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess who lived in the 12th century. Hildegard possessed a remarkable intellect and compiled her observations and insights into comprehensive works on natural history and medicine. Her texts described the properties and uses of hundreds of plants, drawing both on traditional knowledge and her own experience treating the sick. She wrote about familiar herbs like sage and fennel, but also explored the uses of less common plants, always emphasizing the connections between physical health and spiritual well-being. The monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy became particularly renowned for its medical knowledge. Monks there not only preserved classical texts, but also incorporated new observations and remedies. Their infirmary and gardens served as a kind of living laboratory where theory met practice. Visitors to Monte Cassino could consult with experienced herbalist monks and observe treatments that blended ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding. Different monastic orders developed particular expertise with certain aspects of herbal medicine. The Benedictines became especially known for their gardens and their liqueurs, which often began as medicinal cordials made from herbs. The Carthusians developed the famous chartreuse liqueur from a complex formula involving over 100 herbs. While these beverages later became valued for their taste, they originated as therapeutic preparations believed to strengthen and restore health. Monks also played a crucial role in introducing and spreading medicinal plants across Europe. As monasteries established daughter houses in new regions, they brought seeds and cuttings from their physics and gardens. Plants from the Mediterranean gradually found homes in northern climates, adapted through careful cultivation. This quiet botanical exchange enriched the healing resources available in every region. The monastic day followed a rhythm of prayer, work, and study that proved conducive to careful herbalism. The same patience and attention required for spiritual practice translated well to the slow work of tending plants and preparing remedies. Monks ground dried herbs in mortars, steeped them in oils and wines, distilled essences, and created salves and poultices. These preparations were stored in the monastery pharmacy, ready for use when needed. Beyond their walls, monasteries influenced the broader practice of herbal medicine. Local healers often learned from monks or consulted monastery manuscripts. The monastery infirmarian might teach a village woman how to recognize and use certain herbs, spreading knowledge outward into the community. In this way, monastic learning complemented and enriched folk traditions that had their own deep roots. As we move from these peaceful gardens where monks walked in contemplation among their healing plants, we prepare to discover how herbal knowledge flourished in another context. While European monasteries preserved ancient wisdom, scholars in the Islamic world were not merely preserving, but actively expanding botanical and medical knowledge, translating texts, conducting experiments, and making discoveries that would eventually flow back into European understanding. The story of herbal medicine was about to enter a remarkable period of advancement and synthesis, building on foundations that patient monks had helped to maintain through centuries of dedication. As the monastery gardens of medieval Europe preserved their precious botanical knowledge behind stone walls, a magnificent flowering of learning was taking place across a vast expanse stretching from Spain to Persia, from North Africa to Central Asia. While much of Europe struggled through centuries of upheaval, Islamic civilization entered what historians would call its golden age, and within this remarkable period, the science of herbal medicine would reach new heights of sophistication and understanding. The story of Islamic botanical medicine begins with an extraordinary act of cultural preservation. As the Islamic Empire expanded in the 7th and 8th centuries, scholars recognized the immense value of ancient Greek, Roman, Persian, and Indian medical texts. These weren't simply collected and stored away. Instead, in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, dedicated translators worked meticulously to render these precious works into Arabic, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of centuries would not be lost to time. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the 9th century, became a center where scholars from different backgrounds and traditions gathered to study, translate, and discuss medical knowledge, including the extensive writings on medicinal plants. But Islamic physicians and botanists did far more than simply preserve ancient texts. They questioned, tested, and expanded upon what they found in those manuscripts. They added observations from their own medical practices, incorporated knowledge from Persian and Indian traditions, and documented plants unknown to Greek and Roman authors. This wasn't merely translation, it was transformation. Among the most influential of these scholars was Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, who lived in the 9th and 10th centuries. A physician of remarkable breadth, he wrote extensively about medicinal plants and their applications. His medical encyclopedia would later be translated into Latin and used in European universities for centuries. Al-Razi approached herbal medicine with a practical, clinical eye, carefully documenting which remedies worked for which conditions based on his extensive experience treating patients. Then came the figure who would perhaps cast the longest shadow over medieval medicine, both in the Islamic world and far beyond. Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Sina, known to history as Avicenna, was born in 980 near Bukhara in present-day Uzbekistan. A polymath of staggering intellect, he had memorized the Quran by age 10 and mastered medicine by 16. His monumental work, the Canon of Medicine, would become one of the most influential medical texts ever written. The Canon was a systematic encyclopedia that organized all known medical knowledge of the time, including extensive sections on medicinal plants. Avicenna didn't simply list plants and their uses. He organized them logically, described their properties according to a sophisticated system of qualities and degrees, explained how to prepare them, and discussed their effects on the body with remarkable precision. He wrote about over 700 drugs, many of them plant-based, describing their sources, characteristics, and therapeutic applications. When the Canon was translated into Latin in the 12th century, it became a standard medical textbook in European universities and remained so for an astonishing 600 years. Islamic physicians developed new techniques for preparing plant medicines that went beyond anything known in ancient times. They perfected the art of distillation, producing essential oils and aromatic waters from plants. The process of creating rosewater, for instance, became highly refined, and these preparations were used both as medicines and as bases for other remedies. They developed syrups, conserves, and electuaries, pleasant-tasting preparations that made herbal medicines more palatable, especially for children. They understood that the form in which medicine was given mattered, that absorption and effectiveness could vary depending on preparation. The pharmacies of medieval Islamic cities were sophisticated establishments, quite different from simple herb shops. Pharmacists underwent rigorous training and were licensed by medical authorities. They had to demonstrate knowledge of medicinal plants, preparation methods, and proper dosages. In cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, pharmacies stocked hundreds of different plant medicines, carefully labeled and stored. There were regulations governing their practice, quality standards for medicines, and regular inspections to ensure compliance. This represents perhaps the first systematic regulation of pharmaceutical practice in history. Botanical gardens flourished in Islamic cities, serving both practical and scientific purposes. These weren't simply decorative spaces, but living laboratories where physicians and botanists could study plants directly. They cultivated medicinal herbs from across the empire and beyond, experimenting with acclimatizing plants to new environments. Detailed illustrated manuscripts showed what these plants looked like, helping to ensure accurate identification, a critical concern when proper identification could mean the difference between healing and harm. Islamic scholars also made important advances in understanding how medicines worked. They developed theories about drug interactions, recognizing that combining certain plants could enhance or diminish their effects. They discussed concepts of synergy in herbal combinations, ideas that would later re-emerge in modern pharmacology. Their writings show a sophisticated understanding of dose-response relationships, knowing that the same plant could heal in small amounts but harm in larger doses. The geographic scope of Islamic civilization meant that botanists had access to plants from an enormous range of environments. Traders brought medicinal plants from India, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa along established trade routes. Scholars documented these new additions to the Pharmacopoeia, describing plants that had never appeared in Greek or Roman texts. This expansion of botanical knowledge was carefully recorded in Arabic manuscripts that grew increasingly detailed and comprehensive. As Islamic physicians refined their understanding of medicinal plants, they also developed ethical frameworks for medical practice that emphasized patient welfare and professional responsibility. Medical texts included discussions of when to use remedies, when to refrain, and how to do no harm. There was an understanding that being a physician required not just knowledge, but wisdom and compassion. The influence of Islamic herbal medicine would ripple outward across centuries and continents. When these Arabic texts were translated into Latin beginning in the 11th century, they reintroduced much of the ancient Greek and Roman botanical knowledge that had been largely forgotten in Western Europe. But they brought far more than that. They brought advances, refinements, and entirely new plants and preparations. European physicians studying these translations gained access to a sophistication in herbal medicine that hadn't existed in the West for hundreds of years. As night settles over these historical centers of learning, we can imagine the dim glow of oil lamps in pharmacy workrooms where careful hands ground herbs with mortar and pestle, the quiet rustle of pages in libraries where students copied medical manuscripts by candlelight, and the nocturnal fragrance of medicinal gardens where healing plants grew under starlit skies. The Islamic golden age of botanical science represents a crucial chapter in humanity's long relationship with medicinal plants, a time when ancient wisdom was preserved, questioned, tested, and transformed into something richer and more refined. Soon, this knowledge would flow westward, helping to kindle a rebirth of learning in Europe. But that story awaits us in the chapters ahead. For now, rest in the knowledge that even in ages past, dedicated scholars worked to understand how plants could heal, building carefully on what came before, adding their own observations and insights, and passing their hard-won knowledge forward to those who would come after. As the Islamic world was cultivating its golden age of botanical science, far across the Atlantic Ocean, entirely separate traditions of herbal medicine were flourishing in lands unknown to European and Asian scholars. The Americas, stretching from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America, were home to countless indigenous peoples who had spent millennia developing their own sophisticated relationships with the plant world around them. In the dense, humid embrace of the Amazon rainforest, indigenous healers worked with a botanical wealth unlike anywhere else on Earth. This vast green cathedral contained perhaps 1 in 10 of all plant species on the planet, and the peoples living within it had learned to read this abundance with extraordinary skill. They understood which plants could lower fever, which could combat infections, and which held the power to calm troubled minds or mend damaged flesh. Among the most significant of these discoveries was cinchona, a tree whose bark contained compounds that would eventually revolutionize the treatment of malaria worldwide. Growing in the cloud forests of the Andes, cinchona had long been used by Quechua healers to treat fevers and chills. The bark, when prepared as a tea, had remarkable properties that indigenous physicians recognized and applied with great success. They could not have known that the alkaloids within this bark would one day be extracted, studied, and synthesized into medications that would save millions of lives across the globe. Further north, in the high mountain valleys and plateaus of the Andes, other healing traditions developed around different plants. The coca leaf, sacred to many Andean peoples, was used not only for its energizing properties, but also as a medicine. Healers understood how to prepare it to ease altitude sickness, suppress hunger during times of scarcity, and provide relief from various ailments. The plant was woven so deeply into the culture that it appeared in religious ceremonies, social customs, and daily life. In the deserts and valleys of what would become Mexico and Central America, the Aztec and Maya civilizations maintained elaborate gardens of medicinal plants. The Aztecs, in particular, had developed a remarkably organized system of botanical medicine. Their capital city, Tenochtitlan, featured gardens where medicinal plants were cultivated and studied. Healers called Taikitl specialized in diagnosis and treatment, using an extensive pharmacopoeia of local plants. The Aztecs used hundreds of plant species in their healing practices. They prepared remedies from the passion flower for its calming effects, used the vanilla orchid not only as a flavoring, but also medicinally and worked with the dahlia, which had properties useful in treating various conditions. They created detailed classifications of plants and maintained knowledge passed down through generations of careful observation and experimentation. Across the expanse of North America, from the eastern forests to the western plains and beyond, hundreds of distinct indigenous groups each developed their own herbal traditions suited to their environments. In the eastern woodlands, peoples like the Cherokee, Iroquois, and Algonquin developed deep knowledge of the plants growing in the forests around them. They used golden seal for its antibiotic properties, black cohosh for women's health concerns, and slippery elm bark for digestive issues. The plant that would later be called echinacea grew wild on the Great Plains, where peoples like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Pawnee recognized its value in supporting the body's defenses against illness. They used the roots, leaves, and flowers of this purple coneflower to address a variety of concerns, from infections to snake bites. The plant's immune-supporting properties would eventually make it one of the most widely used herbal remedies in modern times. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous peoples worked with the plants of the temperate rainforests. The inner bark of the Pacific yew tree, though not traditionally one of the most prominent medicinal plants in the region, was used by some groups for various purposes. Centuries later, scientists would discover that this slow-growing tree contained compounds with powerful effects against certain cancers, though the indigenous peoples who lived alongside it used it quite differently. What made these various American herbal traditions particularly remarkable was how they developed in complete isolation from the medical systems of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Without any contact with Greek humoral theory, Chinese concepts of qi, or Ayurvedic doshas, indigenous American healers created their own frameworks for understanding health and the role of plants in maintaining it. Many groups developed concepts of balance and harmony with nature that guided their selection and use of medicinal plants. The methods of preparation used by indigenous American healers were diverse and sophisticated. They created teas and decoctions by boiling plant materials, made poultices for external application, prepared tinctures using various extraction methods, and even created early forms of sustained release medicines by combining plant materials with fats or other carriers. Some groups used smoke from burning medicinal plants, while others prepared complex formulas combining multiple plants to achieve specific effects. Knowledge transmission in these societies typically occurred through apprenticeship and oral tradition. Young healers learned by observing and assisting experienced practitioners, memorizing the properties of hundreds of plants, learning to identify them in all seasons, and understanding how to harvest and prepare them correctly. This knowledge was often considered sacred, and healers held respected positions within their communities. The spiritual and practical aspects of plant medicine were deeply intertwined in many indigenous American traditions. Healers often performed ceremonies or prayers when harvesting medicinal plants, both out of respect for the plant and as part of the healing process. This holistic approach viewed physical illness as potentially connected to spiritual or emotional imbalance, and treatment addressed the whole person rather than simply targeting symptoms. When European explorers and colonizers began arriving in the Americas, they encountered these rich herbal traditions with varying degrees of interest and respect. Some colonists, facing illnesses in unfamiliar environments, eagerly learned about local medicinal plants from indigenous peoples. This exchange would eventually carry American medicinal plants back across the Atlantic, where they would find their way into European pharmacopoeias and gardens. Yet this transfer of knowledge came at a terrible cost, as colonization devastated indigenous populations and disrupted traditional ways of life, including the transmission of herbal wisdom from one generation to the next. Despite these profound disruptions, many indigenous herbal traditions have persisted, protected by communities determined to preserve their ancestral knowledge. Today, ethnobotanists and medical researchers work to document and study these traditions with greater respect for their origins, recognizing that the plant knowledge of indigenous Americas represents thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation, as valuable as any medical tradition developed elsewhere in the world. As the knowledge of medicinal plants spread across continents through trade routes and cultural exchange, a remarkable transformation was taking place in Europe. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 would forever change how botanical wisdom was preserved and shared. For the first time in human history, the carefully guarded secrets of plant healing could be reproduced in multiple copies, reaching far beyond the monastery walls and physicians' private libraries, where such knowledge had previously been confined. The earliest printed herbals emerged in the late 15th century, humble beginnings to what would become a flood of botanical literature. These first books often reproduced medieval manuscripts, their illustrations crude woodcuts that sometimes bore little resemblance to the actual plants they purported to represent. Yet even these primitive volumes represented something revolutionary. A gardener in Germany could now own the same book as a physician in Italy, studying identical descriptions and illustrations of healing plants. As we settle deeper into this chapter of our story, we encounter the great herbalists of the Renaissance, men whose names would become synonymous with botanical study. Otto Brunfels, a former Carthusian monk who had left monastic life, published his Herbarium Vivae Iconis in 1530. Working with the talented artist Hans Weiditz, Brunfels created something unprecedented: illustrations drawn directly from living plants rather than copied from earlier manuscripts. The woodcuts in his Herbal showed actual specimens with stunning accuracy, complete with wilted leaves and insect damage, capturing the reality of plants as they grew in nature. Following closely behind came Hieronymus Bock, known by his Latinized name Tragus, whose new Kräuterbuch appeared in 1539. Bock brought a different approach to herbal writing. Rather than simply repeating ancient authorities, he wrote from personal observation, describing where plants grew wild in the German countryside and how local people used them. His writing carried the fresh air of the forest and field, bringing readers along on his botanical expeditions through meadow and woodland. But perhaps no Renaissance herbalist achieved greater influence than Leonhard Fuchs, a German physician and botanist whose De Historia Stirpium appeared in 1542. This magnificent volume described approximately 500 plants with remarkable precision. Fuchs organized his material systematically, providing for each plant its various names in different languages, a detailed description, its location and growing season, and its medicinal properties according to both ancient authorities and contemporary practice. The illustrations in Fuchs's Herbal, created by artists Albrecht Meyer and Heinrich Fühlmaurer, set a new standard for botanical accuracy. So precise were these images that botanists could identify species centuries later. The beautiful magenta flower we know as fuchsia bears his name to this day, a living memorial to his contributions. Across the Channel in England, William Turner was creating what many consider the first true English herbal. A physician, naturalist, and reformer, Turner published his new herbal in 3 parts between 1551 and 1568. Turner corrected many errors that had crept into earlier works, identifying English plants with their classical names and describing their properties in clear, accessible language. He wrote not in Latin, but in English, making botanical knowledge available to those who could not read the language of scholars. The tradition of printed herbals reached perhaps its most elaborate expression in the work of John Gerard, an English barber surgeon who maintained several gardens in London. His Herbal, or General History of Plant, published in 1597, became one of the most beloved botanical books in the English language. Gerard described nearly 3,000 plants, drawing on his own experience growing many of them in his gardens. His writing possessed a charming personality, filled with personal anecdotes and observations. Though modern scholars have noted that Gerard sometimes borrowed heavily from earlier works, particularly the Belgian botanist Rembert Dodoens, his Herbal captured the imagination of generations of readers. Its pages contain not just botanical information, but stories, folklore, and practical advice that made plants come alive. As the 17th century dawned, herbals continued to evolve. John Parkinson, royal apothecary to James I, published his Theatrum Botanicum in 1640, an enormous work describing nearly 4,000 plants. The book's very size testified to the expanding botanical knowledge of the age, as plants from distant lands began appearing in European gardens and pharmacies. Nicholas Culpeper brought yet another dimension to herbal literature. His Complete Herbal, published in 1653, combined traditional plant medicine with astrology, assigning each plant to a ruling planet and describing how celestial influences affected their healing properties. Though his astrological framework found less favor with later scientific minds, Culpeper's Herbal became enormously popular. He wrote in plain English, deliberately making medical knowledge accessible to common people who could not afford expensive physicians. His book remains in print today, having never gone out of publication, a testament to its enduring appeal. These printed herbals accomplished something profound beyond merely cataloguing plants and their uses. They created a shared visual and textual language for discussing botanical medicine. A physician in Prague and an apothecary in Paris could look at the same illustration and read the same description, bringing standardization to what had been a fragmented field where local traditions and individual experiences dominated. The woodcuts and engravings in these books, painstakingly carved and printed, allowed people who had never seen a particular plant to recognize it when encountered in field or market. The herbals also preserved knowledge at a critical time, as European societies underwent tremendous changes as old ways of life disappeared and populations moved from countryside to city. The printed page captured botanical wisdom that might otherwise have been lost. Traditional plant lore passed down through oral tradition was written down, fixed in ink and paper, saved for future generations. Yet these beautiful books represented more than preservation. They sparked curiosity and encouraged observation. Readers compared the descriptions in their herbals with plants growing around them, noting differences and discovering new uses. The Herbals inspired people to create gardens, to seek out rare plants, to experiment with preparing remedies. They fostered a culture of botanical interest that spread through all levels of society. As we allow these images to drift through our consciousness, the elegant woodcuts and carefully set type, the dedication of artists and authors who labored to capture the essence of healing plants, we can rest in the knowledge that human curiosity and care have always worked to preserve and share wisdom. The great Herbals of the Renaissance stand as monuments to collaboration between art and science, between tradition and innovation, between the desire to help and the joy of discovery. Their pages whisper across centuries, inviting us to see the wonder in the green world around us. As the printing presses of Renaissance Europe continued their steady rhythm, distributing herbals and botanical knowledge across the continent, ships were already setting sail on voyages that would forever transform the world's understanding of medicinal plants. The age of exploration had begun, and with it came an unprecedented exchange of botanical treasures that would cross oceans and continents, mingling healing traditions that had developed in isolation for thousands of years. When Christopher Columbus returned from his first voyage in 1493, he brought with him more than tales of distant lands. Among his cargo were plants entirely unknown to European eyes, specimens that would puzzle and excite the physicians and herbalists who examined them. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean had shared their knowledge of local remedies, plants they had used for generations to treat fevers, wounds, and countless other ailments. This was merely the beginning of a botanical exchange that would reshape medicine on every inhabited continent. The Spanish conquistadors who followed Columbus into the Americas encountered civilizations with sophisticated medical traditions. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan boasted extensive botanical gardens where medicinal plants were cultivated and studied with remarkable care. Aztec physicians maintained detailed knowledge of hundreds of healing plants, knowledge that had been refined over centuries of careful observation and use. When Spanish physician Francisco Hernandez arrived in New Spain in 1570, he spent 7 years documenting this vast store of botanical wisdom, describing more than 3,000 plants used by indigenous healers. His work, though not published in full for many years, represented one of the first systematic attempts to bridge two entirely different medical traditions. From the Americas, plants began their journey eastward that would profoundly influence global medicine. Cinchona bark, used by indigenous peoples of Peru to treat fevers, would eventually yield quinine, transforming the treatment of malaria. Tobacco, despite its later controversial status, was initially valued by European physicians as a medicinal herb. The cocoa plant brought both culinary delight and medicinal applications, while the humble tomato and potato, though initially met with suspicion, would eventually become dietary staples with their own nutritional benefits. The exchange flowed in multiple directions, creating a complex web of botanical knowledge spanning the globe. European colonists and missionaries brought their familiar herbs to new lands, establishing gardens filled with plants from home. They planted chamomile and lavender, rosemary and sage, hoping these familiar remedies would flourish in foreign soil. In many cases, these European plants adapted remarkably well to new environments, sometimes becoming so established that later generations would forget they were ever foreign imports. Meanwhile, Portuguese traders sailing around Africa and into Asian waters opened new channels for botanical exchange. The Portuguese established trading posts from Brazil to Goa to Macau, creating networks through which plants and botanical knowledge could flow. Ginger and turmeric from India reached European markets in greater quantities than ever before. Chinese medicinal herbs found their way to South American ports. African plants traveled both eastward and westward, enriching medical traditions on distant shores. The Dutch, with their talent for commerce and cultivation, became particularly skilled at this botanical trade. The Dutch East India Company established gardens in their colonies, specifically for growing and studying medicinal plants. They brought Indonesian spices, not just for culinary purposes, but for their valued medicinal properties. Cloves and nutmeg, cinnamon and cardamom, all treasured in traditional medicine systems, became commodities in a global market that increasingly recognized both their flavor and their therapeutic potential. In these colonial outposts, fascinating collaborations sometimes emerged between European physicians and local healers. Some European doctors, far from the medical establishments of their homelands, proved remarkably open to learning from indigenous practitioners. They observed treatments that seemed effective, noted which plants local people turned to for various ailments, and began cautiously experimenting with these new remedies themselves. These physicians wrote letters home describing their discoveries, and gradually, plants from distant lands entered the European medical repertoire. The botanical gardens established in this era became living libraries of global plant knowledge. The garden at Leiden in the Netherlands, founded in 1590, acquired plants from across the expanding known world. Padua's Botanical Garden, established even earlier, constantly added specimens from newly explored regions. These gardens served not merely as pleasant spaces, but as research centers, where physicians and botanists could study foreign plants, attempt to understand their properties, and determine how they might be cultivated in European climates. This exchange of plants brought new challenges alongside new opportunities. European physicians struggled to understand how plants from distant healing traditions should be used. The traditional knowledge that accompanied these plants in their homelands often traveled incompletely, or not at all. A root or bark arriving in a European port came divorced from the complex understanding of how indigenous healers had prepared and administered it, what conditions they treated with it, and what precautions they observed. European doctors sometimes misapplied these remedies, using plants in ways their traditional practitioners never would have, leading to both unexpected successes and puzzling failures. The slave trade, that dark chapter of colonial history, also contributed to botanical exchange in ways often overlooked. Enslaved peoples brought knowledge of African medicinal plants with them across the Atlantic. In the Americas, they recognized plants similar to those they had known in Africa, adapted their healing practices to available local plants, and sometimes successfully grew African species in new environments. This forced migration of people tragically resulted in a migration of botanical knowledge, creating new fusion traditions of herbal medicine in the Caribbean and Americas that blended African, indigenous American, and European practices. By the 18th century, the pace of botanical exchange had accelerated further. European powers competed not just for territory, but for botanical knowledge and valuable plant species. Britain established Kew Gardens as a centre for collecting and studying plants from across its expanding empire. The French created their own networks of botanical gardens in colonies worldwide. Ships carried seeds and live plants carefully packed in specialized containers, attempting to transport valuable species from one climate to another. The breadfruit voyages, though most famous for the mutiny on the Bounty, exemplified this determination to move plants across oceans for human benefit. This era of exchange enriched every medical tradition it touched. Chinese physicians gained access to American ginseng, which they found similar, yet distinctly different from Asian varieties. Indian Ayurvedic practitioners incorporated new herbs into their ancient framework of understanding. European herbalists expanded their materia medica exponentially. African healers in various regions encountered plants from distant parts of their own vast continent, as well as from foreign lands entirely. As ships continued their journeys and plants crossed oceans in every direction, the stage was being set for a new transformation in the story of herbal medicine. The accumulated knowledge of medicinal plants from around the world would soon meet the emerging tools of chemistry and scientific investigation, leading to discoveries that would change medicine forever. As the great sailing ships of the colonial era continued their voyages across the world's oceans, carrying botanical treasures and traditional knowledge between continents, a quieter revolution was beginning in the laboratories of Europe. In small rooms filled with glass vessels and curious instruments, a new generation of investigators was asking a different kind of question about the healing plants that had served humanity for millennia. They wondered not simply which plants could cure which ailments, but why they worked at all. The turning point arrived in the opening years of the 19th century, in the German city of Paderborn, where a young pharmacist's apprentice named Friedrich Saturna was conducting experiments that would forever change the relationship between plants and medicine. Working in his spare time, often late into the quiet evening hours, Saturna was fascinated by opium, the dried latex of the poppy plant that had relieved pain and brought sleep to countless sufferers since ancient times. But opium's effects were unpredictable, varying greatly depending on where the poppies grew, how the latex was collected, and how the remedy was prepared. Saturna believed something specific within the plant must be responsible for its remarkable properties. Through patient, methodical work, Saturna treated opium with various acids and alkalis, carefully observing what happened at each step. In 1804, after numerous attempts, he managed to isolate a crystalline substance that possessed all of opium's pain-relieving powers in a far more concentrated and predictable form. He named his discovery morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. For the first time in human history, someone had extracted a pure, active compound from a medicinal plant. The significance of this achievement rippled slowly through the scientific community, as many were initially skeptical of the young apprentice's claims. But Saturna's method opened a door that could not be closed. If morphine could be isolated from opium, perhaps other plants concealed similar secrets. Perhaps every healing herb contained specific substances responsible for its effects, waiting to be discovered and purified. In the decades that followed, laboratories across Europe became scenes of intense botanical investigation. Chemists developed new techniques for extracting, purifying, and identifying plant compounds. In 1820, French pharmacists isolated quinine from the bark of the cinchona tree, providing a reliable treatment for malaria that had plagued humanity throughout its history. The irregular supply and varying potency of cinchona bark had limited its usefulness. But pure quinine could be measured precisely and administered with confidence. The pace of discovery accelerated through the middle years of the 19th century. Caffeine was isolated from coffee beans, revealing the molecular basis for the drink's stimulating effects. Atropine emerged from deadly nightshade, explaining both the plant's poisonous nature and its curious ability to dilate the pupils. Cocaine came from coca leaves, digitoxin from foxglove, and strychnine from the seeds of the strychnos tree. Each discovery added another piece to an emerging puzzle, showing that plants produced these substances for their own purposes, often as defenses against insects or animals, but that human bodies responded to them in profound and sometimes useful ways. This new science needed a name, and gradually the term pharmacology took hold, derived from the Greek words for drug and study. The pharmacologists were different from the herbalists and physicians who had come before them. They worked not primarily with whole plants, but with pure substances. They used scales and measures rather than intuition and experience. They sought to understand precisely how these plant compounds affected the body, testing them on animals and observing the results with scientific rigor. The transformation this represented was both exciting and bittersweet. For thousands of years, the knowledge of healing plants had been passed down through families, held by traditional healers, recorded in ancient texts, and refined through countless observations of what worked and what did not. Now, that accumulated wisdom was being translated into a new language of chemistry and physiology. A tea brewed from willow bark became salicylic acid. A poultice of foxglove leaves became a measured dose of Digitalis glycosides. The plants themselves began to fade into the background as their active ingredients took center stage. Yet something important was preserved in this transition. The new pharmacologists were not inventing medicines from nothing, but rather following trails blazed by centuries of traditional plant use. When they tested these isolated compounds, they were confirming what herbalists had long known through observation and experience. The Amazon healers who chewed coca leaves, the Chinese physicians who prescribed mahuang for breathing problems, the European wise women who gave foxglove for dropsy, all had been working with these same powerful molecules, even without knowing their chemical names or structures. The German chemist Justus von Liebig became one of the champions of this new approach, training a generation of students in the methods of analyzing plant compounds. His laboratory in Gießen attracted aspiring scientists from across Europe and beyond, who learned to break down plant materials into their constituent parts and identify the substances responsible for biological effects. These students carried the techniques back to their home countries, establishing new centers of pharmaceutical research. As the 19th century progressed, the pharmaceutical industry began to emerge from these discoveries. Companies established themselves to manufacture and distribute pure plant compounds, promising reliable potency and standardized effects. The irregular quality that had always plagued herbal medicine, one batch of herbs more potent than another, one harvest different from the last, could be overcome through chemistry. A gram of morphine was a gram of morphine, whether it came from Turkish poppies or Indian ones, whether extracted in spring or fall. This standardization brought tremendous benefits. Doctors could prescribe precise doses with confidence in their effects. Patients could trust that their medicine would work consistently. Life-threatening conditions could be treated with compounds of known strength and purity. The ancient dream of reliable, effective healing seemed finally within reach, built on the foundation of plants, but refined through the tools of modern science. Yet even as they celebrated these achievements, some pharmacologists remained humble before the complexity of the plants they studied. They recognized that isolating a single compound was only the beginning of understanding. Many plants contained dozens or even hundreds of different substances, interacting in ways that were not yet comprehended. The whole plant remedy sometimes worked differently than its isolated active ingredient, suggesting mysteries still to be unraveled. As the 20th century approached, pharmacology had established itself as a legitimate scientific discipline, with university departments, specialized journals, and a growing body of knowledge. The path from traditional herbal remedy to modern medicine had been traced, though the journey was far from complete. Behind every pharmaceutical breakthrough lay the shadow of a plant, and behind every plant lay generations of human experience, learning slowly which gifts from the green world could ease suffering and restore health. As the 19th century drew to a close and a new century dawned, the transformation of plant remedies into standardized medicines gathered remarkable momentum. The chemists had shown the way forward by isolating pure compounds from botanical sources. And now physicians and researchers began the careful work of turning age-old folk remedies into reliable pharmaceutical preparations that could be measured, standardized, and prescribed with confidence. The story of aspirin begins not in a laboratory, but in ancient meadows, where willow trees grew beside streams and rivers. For thousands of years, people across many cultures had discovered that chewing willow bark could ease pain and reduce fever. The Greek physician Hippocrates had written of willow bark's properties, and countless generations had turned to this remedy when suffering called for relief. The bark contained salicin, a compound that the body converts into salicylic acid. And in the early 1800s, chemists had successfully isolated this active ingredient. But salicylic acid, while effective, caused considerable stomach upset and had an unpleasant taste that made it difficult for patients to tolerate. In the laboratories of the Bayer company in Germany, a chemist named Felix Hoffmann worked on a challenge that was both professional and deeply personal. His father suffered from rheumatoid arthritis and could barely tolerate the salicylic acid prescribed for his pain. In 1897, Hoffmann synthesized acetyl salicylic acid, a modified form of the willow bark compound that proved gentler on the stomach while retaining the pain-relieving and fever-reducing properties. Bayer began marketing this new preparation under the name Aspirin in 1899, and within a few years, it had become one of the most widely used medicines in the world. Here was a plant remedy, refined and improved through chemistry, that maintained its connection to the willow tree while becoming something new and more useful. The tale of Digitalis follows a different path, but arrives at a similar destination. In the English countryside of Shropshire, a physician named William Withering heard in 1775 about an old woman who prepared a family remedy for dropsy, the uncomfortable swelling caused by heart failure and fluid retention. This folk remedy contained numerous herbs But withering, through careful observation and methodical experimentation, determined that the active ingredient came from the foxglove plant, with its tall spires of purple bell-shaped flowers. Withering spent 10 years studying foxglove, testing it on patients, carefully documenting doses and effects, noting which preparations worked and which proved dangerous. The plant contained powerful compounds that could strengthen the heart's contractions and regulate its rhythm, but the margin between a helpful dose and a harmful one was narrow indeed. In 1785, he published his findings in An Account of the Foxglove and Some of Its Medical Uses, a work that combined folk wisdom with systematic scientific investigation. Here was a physician who respected traditional knowledge enough to investigate it thoroughly, and rigorous enough to determine exactly how and when it should be used. For more than a century after Withering's work, doctors prescribed Digitalis leaf in various preparations, but the potency of different batches varied considerably depending on where the plants were grown, when they were harvested, and how they were prepared. In the early 20th century, pharmaceutical companies finally succeeded in isolating and purifying the specific compounds responsible for foxglove's effects, primarily digoxin and digitoxin. These standardized preparations allowed doctors to prescribe exact doses with confidence, transforming an unreliable folk remedy into a precise medicine that would save countless lives over the coming decades. The story of quinine offers another window into this transformation. The cinchona tree bark from South America had long been used by indigenous peoples to treat fevers, and Spanish colonizers brought this knowledge back to Europe in the 17th century, where cinchona bark became known as Jesuits' bark. For 2 centuries, the bark remained a valuable but imperfect remedy for malaria, with varying potency and uncertain effectiveness. In 1820, French chemists Pierre-Joseph Pelletier and Joseph Bien-Aimé Caventou isolated quinine, the active compound responsible for cinchona's anti-malarial properties. This pure substance could be measured precisely and manufactured in standardized doses, making it far more reliable than the crude bark preparations that had preceded it. The demand for quinine became so great, particularly as European powers expanded their colonial presence in tropical regions where malaria was endemic, that cinchona trees were transplanted to plantations in Java, India, and other suitable climates. Here was a plant medicine that had become so important to global health and commerce that it reshaped agriculture and trade patterns across continents. Cocaine's journey from traditional use to pharmaceutical preparation illustrates both the promise and the complexity of plant-derived medicines. Indigenous peoples of the Andes had chewed coca leaves for thousands of years, finding that the plant helped with altitude sickness, provided energy, and reduced hunger during long journeys through mountain terrain. In 1860, the German chemist Albert Niemann isolated cocaine from coca leaves, and the pure compound quickly found medical applications as a local anesthetic. Physicians discovered that cocaine could numb tissue effectively, making it particularly valuable in eye surgery and dental procedures. For a brief period, cocaine was celebrated as a wonder drug, added to tonics and medicines with little understanding of its potential for harm. The experience with cocaine taught the medical community important lessons about the difference between traditional plant use and concentrated chemical extracts. When indigenous peoples chewed coca leaves, they absorbed small amounts of the active compounds slowly, in a form buffered by the plant's other constituents. The isolated, concentrated cocaine produced far more intense effects and carried risks that traditional use had not revealed would. This realization would shape how scientists approached plant medicines in the decades to come, recognizing that plants contain complex mixtures of compounds that sometimes work together in ways that isolated chemicals cannot replicate. As the 20th century approached, pharmaceutical companies had established a new model for plant medicines. Traditional remedies would be studied and validated, active compounds identified and isolated, and standardized preparations manufactured that could be prescribed with precision. This approach represented neither a rejection of traditional knowledge nor a simple continuation of it, but rather a transformation that maintained connections to botanical roots while embracing the tools of modern chemistry and medicine. The plants that had served humanity for millennia were yielding their secrets more fully, and those secrets were being shaped into medicines that could travel the world, stored in bottles with precise labels, rather than passed down through oral tradition and seasonal harvests. These early plant-derived pharmaceuticals paved the way for countless medicines to come, establishing patterns and principles that would guide drug development throughout the 20th century and beyond. As the 20th century dawned, the relationship between humanity and medicinal plants entered a remarkable new phase. The previous century had witnessed the isolation of individual compounds from traditional remedies, transforming ancient plant knowledge into modern pharmaceuticals. Now, scientists would embark on a systematic exploration of the plant kingdom, seeking new healing substances among the world's extraordinary botanical diversity. What they would discover would revolutionize the treatment of some of humanity's most challenging diseases. The story of one of the century's most important plant discoveries begins on the tropical island of Madagascar, a place where evolution had worked in isolation for millions of years, creating plants found nowhere else on Earth. Among these unique species grew a modest flowering plant with glossy green leaves and delicate pink or white blooms. Local people knew it well, this Madagascar periwinkle, and traditional healers had long used it to treat various ailments, including diabetes. In the late 1950s, researchers became interested in these traditional uses and began analyzing the plant's chemical composition. What they found surprised them entirely. While the periwinkle showed little promise for treating diabetes, it contained compounds that seemed to affect rapidly dividing cells. Further investigation revealed something extraordinary. The plant produced substances called vinblastine and vincristine, alkaloids that could interfere with cell division in a very specific way. These compounds worked by disrupting the formation of structures that cells need to divide, called microtubules. For cancer cells, which divide uncontrollably, this interference proved devastating. By the 1960s, both vinblastine and vincristine had entered clinical use, dramatically improving survival rates for certain cancers, particularly childhood leukemia and Hodgkin's lymphoma. A plant that had quietly grown on a distant island for countless generations now offered hope to patients around the world. The Madagascar periwinkle story inspired a renewed interest in exploring plants used in traditional medicine systems. Researchers began working more closely with ethnobotanists, scientists who study how different cultures use plants, and with traditional healers who held generations of accumulated knowledge about local plant species and their properties. Another crucial discovery emerged from the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest, where massive yew trees had stood for centuries. The Pacific yew was not a particularly celebrated tree. It grew slowly in the understory of conifer forests, often considered little more than a weed by timber companies. Indigenous peoples of the region had used various parts of the yew for tools, ceremonies, and some medicinal purposes, but few outsiders paid much attention to this unassuming tree. In the early 1960s, as part of a broad screening program to test plants for anti-cancer properties, researchers collected samples from the Pacific yew's bark. The initial results showed promise, and a compound called Taxol was isolated in 1967. Understanding how Taxol worked took several more years, but eventually scientists discovered that it had a mechanism almost opposite to the periwinkle compounds. Rather than preventing microtubules from forming, Taxol stabilized them, preventing them from breaking down, and thereby also disrupting cancer cell division. The path from discovery to treatment proved long and complicated. Taxol existed in very small quantities in yew bark, and extracting enough to treat a single patient required several mature trees. Environmental concerns arose about harvesting these slow-growing trees from ancient forests. Eventually, scientists found ways to produce Taxol semi-synthetically using compounds from the needles of more common yew species, and later through plant cell fermentation techniques. By the early 1990s, Taxol, marketed as paclitaxel, became an important treatment for ovarian, breast, and lung cancers. The same decades brought discoveries from many other botanical sources. In China, researchers investigated traditional anti-malarial remedies and rediscovered a herb called sweet wormwood, or qinghao in Chinese, which had been mentioned in ancient texts for treating fevers. A scientist named Tu Yoyu led the effort to isolate the active compound, artemisinin, in the 1970s. Her work, which would eventually earn a Nobel Prize, provided a powerful new weapon against malaria, particularly drug-resistant strains that had become increasingly problematic. Meanwhile, other scientists explored plants from different ecosystems. The rosy periwinkle of Madagascar had demonstrated that island ecosystems, with their unique evolutionary histories, might harbor unusual medicinal compounds. Researchers turned attention to other biodiversity hotspots, particularly tropical rainforests, where the sheer variety of plant species suggested vast potential for undiscovered medicines. In the Amazon, ethnobotanists documented indigenous knowledge of thousands of medicinal plants. Some of these, like cat's claw and sangre de drago, began appearing in commercial herbal preparations, though often with limited clinical research. The challenge became distinguishing between traditional uses that reflected genuine therapeutic properties and those based on cultural beliefs without direct biological activity. African traditional medicine also attracted scientific attention. The bark of the African cherry tree, used traditionally for urinary problems, was studied and found to contain compounds that appeared helpful for prostate conditions. Similarly, investigation of the African potato plant, used by traditional healers, led to research into its immune system effects. Throughout this era of discovery, the relationship between traditional knowledge and scientific validation remained complex. Ethnobotanists worked to document indigenous plant knowledge before it disappeared as traditional cultures changed, and elders who held this information passed away. Questions arose about intellectual property, fair compensation for traditional knowledge, and ensuring that communities whose ancestors had discovered these plants' properties would benefit from any commercial development. The 20th century also saw increased scientific understanding of medicinal plants already in use. Researchers studied ginkgo biloba, used in Chinese medicine for thousands of years, investigating its effects on circulation and cognitive function. They examined milk thistle, used since ancient times for liver ailments, and identified silymarin as its active compound complex. St. John's wort, a traditional European remedy for melancholy, underwent clinical trials that suggested effectiveness for mild to moderate depression, though also revealing important interactions with other medications. As the century progressed, pharmaceutical companies established natural products divisions, sending researchers into remote regions to collect plant samples. Thousands upon thousands of plants were screened for biological activity against various diseases. Some programs focused on specific conditions, like cancer or infectious diseases, while others cast wider nets, testing plants for any interesting biological effects. Not every promising lead resulted in a new medicine. Many plants used traditionally showed no measurable activity under laboratory conditions. Others contained active compounds that proved too toxic, too difficult to extract in useful quantities, or too complex to synthesize economically. Yet enough discoveries succeeded to justify continued exploration of the plant kingdom's pharmaceutical potential. The century's botanical discoveries demonstrated that traditional plant knowledge often pointed toward genuine therapeutic compounds, even when the traditional understanding of how these plants worked differed from the molecular mechanisms scientists eventually uncovered. Ancient healers might not have known about alkaloids or cell division, but their careful observations over generations had identified plants with real biological effects. As the 20th century drew to a close, the search for medicinal plants continued with new urgency, knowing that rainforest destruction and cultural changes were rapidly eliminating both plant species and traditional knowledge. The discoveries already made had saved countless lives, and they hinted at possibilities still hidden in the world's remaining wild places, waiting to reveal their secrets to careful observers, just as plants had done for thousands of years before. As we drift deeper into the science of botanical healing, let us pause now to consider something truly remarkable. After traveling through millennia of human experience with medicinal plants, after witnessing countless generations discover that certain leaves could soothe a fever or particular roots could ease pain, we arrive at perhaps the most fascinating question of all. How do these plant medicines actually work within the intricate landscape of our bodies? The story begins not with humans at all, but with the plants themselves, growing quietly in forests and meadows, producing an extraordinary array of chemical compounds. Plants, rooted in place and unable to flee from hungry insects or grazing animals, have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to defend themselves through chemistry. They manufacture thousands upon thousands of different molecules, many of which serve as deterrents to creatures that might otherwise consume them. Some taste bitter, discouraging browsing deer. Others prove mildly toxic to insects, protecting tender leaves from destruction. Still others attract beneficial insects or help the plant communicate with neighboring vegetation. This vast chemical arsenal, developed through countless generations of evolutionary refinement, happens to interact with animal biology in profound and sometimes helpful ways. When we consume a medicinal plant, we are introducing these foreign molecules into our own bodies, where they encounter the complex machinery of human cells. Our cells contain countless proteins, each performing specific tasks. Some act as receptors, receiving chemical signals. Others function as enzymes, catalyzing reactions. Still others serve as channels, controlling what enters and exits the cell. The molecules from plants can interact with these proteins in remarkably precise ways, much like keys fitting into locks. Sometimes a plant compound fits perfectly into a receptor site, triggering a response. Other times, it blocks a receptor, preventing the body's own signaling molecules from binding there. The specificity of these interactions can be astonishingly precise, with molecular shapes matching at the level of individual atoms. Consider the alkaloids, nitrogen-containing compounds that plants produce in abundance when the opium poppy synthesizes morphine. It creates a molecule whose shape closely resembles compounds our own bodies produce called endorphins, our natural pain relievers. When morphine enters the human bloodstream and travels to the brain, it finds receptors specifically shaped to receive endorphin molecules. The morphine fits into these receptors, triggering the same pain-relieving signals that our own endorphins would activate, but often more powerfully and for longer durations. The plant, quite accidentally from its own perspective, has created a master key to our pain control systems. The cardiac glycosides found in foxglove work through an entirely different mechanism. These compounds interact with proteins embedded in heart muscle. Cell membranes, proteins that normally pump sodium and potassium ions in carefully regulated exchanges. By interfering with these pumps, Digitalis compounds alter the electrical properties of heart cells, changing the rhythm and force of cardiac contractions. A physician must prescribe these substances with extraordinary care, for the difference between a therapeutic dose and a dangerous one can be surprisingly small. Yet when used properly, these plant molecules can restore regular rhythm to hearts that beat irregularly, improving circulation and easing the burden on weakened cardiac muscle. Many plant medicines work by influencing the activity of enzymes, the molecular machines that carry out chemical reactions in our bodies. The salicylic acid in willow bark, which led to the development of aspirin, inhibits an enzyme called cyclooxygenase. This enzyme normally helps produce prostaglandins, signaling molecules involved in inflammation, pain, and fever. By blocking this enzyme, salicylic acid reduces the production of prostaglandins, thereby reducing inflammation and the sensations of pain. The elegance of this mechanism lies in its simplicity. One molecule interfering with one enzyme, creating cascading effects throughout the body's inflammatory systems. Some plant compounds work not by targeting specific proteins, but by affecting the physical properties of cell membranes themselves. The terpenoids found in many aromatic herbs can insert themselves into the lipid layers that form cell boundaries, altering membrane fluidity and permeability. Others act as antioxidants, intercepting reactive oxygen molecules that would otherwise damage cellular components. The polyphenols in green tea, for instance, can neutralize free radicals, those unstable molecules that contribute to cellular aging and damage. The question naturally arises: why do these plant molecules interact so specifically with human biology? The answer lies partly in our shared evolutionary heritage. Plants and animals diverged from common ancestors billions of years ago, yet we retain fundamental similarities in our cellular machinery. Both plants and animals use similar types of proteins, similar signaling pathways, similar energy production systems. When a plant evolves a compound to affect its own cellular processes, that compound may also affect similar processes in animals. Additionally, some plant defenses work precisely because they interfere with animal biology. A compound that disrupts insect nerve function, for instance, might also interact with mammalian neurons, though perhaps with different effects. The journey of a plant medicine through the human body follows predictable stages. First comes absorption, as molecules pass through the lining of the digestive tract, or, in some preparations, through the skin or lungs. The bloodstream then carries these compounds throughout the body, distributing them to various tissues. Some molecules cross easily into the brain. Others remain primarily in the bloodstream or concentrate in particular organs. The liver, that remarkable chemical processing plant, works to metabolize foreign compounds, often converting them into forms more easily eliminated. Finally, the kidneys filter these molecules and their metabolites from the blood, excreting them in urine. The time course of these processes determines how long a plant medicine remains active in the body. Different plant medicines follow different paths through this journey. Some work quickly, producing effects within minutes or hours. Others accumulate gradually over days or weeks before their benefits become apparent. Some are absorbed efficiently from the digestive tract. Others pass through largely unchanged. Understanding these pharmacokinetic properties helps explain why traditional preparations took such varied forms. Some plants were brewed as teas, others applied as poultices, still others dried and powdered for consumption with food. Modern research continues to reveal new mechanisms by which plant medicines influence human health. Scientists have discovered that some plant compounds affect gene expression itself, turning certain genes on or off without altering the underlying DNA sequence. Others influence the communities of microorganisms living in our intestines, the microbiome, which in turn affects our health in numerous ways. Still other plant molecules seem to work through multiple mechanisms simultaneously, creating complex webs of effects throughout our interconnected biological systems. As we rest here in contemplation of these molecular interactions, we can appreciate both the sophistication of traditional knowledge and the insights provided by modern science. Those ancient healers who discovered that certain plants could help certain conditions were observing the outward manifestations of these intricate molecular dances. They could not see the receptors binding or the enzymes being inhibited, yet through careful observation and accumulated experience, they learned which plants produced which effects. Now, as we understand the mechanisms underlying these effects, we bridge the wisdom of ages past with the precision of contemporary science, each illuminating the other in the continuing story of botanical healing. As we've explored the scientific mechanisms by which plant medicines work within our bodies, let us now turn our attention to how herbal medicine exists in our modern world, woven into the daily lives of people across every continent in ways both ancient and surprisingly contemporary. In Germany, where precision and scientific rigor have long been cultural touchstones, herbal medicine holds an official place within the healthcare system, that might surprise those accustomed to thinking of plant remedies as purely alternative. Here, the Commission E, established in 1978, has conducted systematic reviews of hundreds of herbal substances, creating monographs that guide physicians and patients alike. German doctors write prescriptions for St. John's wort to support mental well-being, and ginkgo biloba for cognitive function. Remedies dispensed from pharmacies alongside conventional medications. The shelves of German Apotheken display standardized herbal preparations, with the same careful labeling and quality control as synthetic drugs, a reflection of the country's unique integration of traditional plant knowledge with modern pharmaceutical standards. This German model represents just one approach to herbal medicine in the contemporary world. Across Asia, traditional systems continue to flourish with remarkable vitality. In China, hospitals dedicated entirely to traditional Chinese medicine stand alongside Western-style medical facilities, often within the same city blocks. Patients might visit a TCM practitioner who examines their tongue and pulse before prescribing a carefully calibrated formula of dried roots, barks, and leaves, then walk next door for a CT scan. The Chinese government has invested heavily in researching and standardizing traditional herbal formulas, seeking to validate ancient wisdom with contemporary scientific methods, while preserving the holistic philosophy that has guided Chinese medicine for millennia. Japan has developed its own variation called Kampo medicine, adapting Chinese herbal formulas to Japanese preferences and integrating them into the national health insurance system. Japanese physicians can prescribe nearly 150 Kampo formulas manufactured by pharmaceutical companies to exacting standards. These remedies appear not as exotic alternatives, but as routine treatment options, prescribed for everything from supporting digestive comfort to addressing menopausal transitions. The Japanese approach demonstrates how traditional plant medicine can exist comfortably within a highly technologically advanced healthcare system. In India, Ayurveda remains a living tradition, practiced by hundreds of thousands of registered practitioners. The Indian government recognizes Ayurvedic medicine as a complete medical system, with its own colleges, hospitals, and research institutes. Patients might choose between allopathic and Ayurvedic treatment, or combine both approaches. The subcontinent's streets are lined with shops selling Ayurvedic preparations, from the simple herbal powders to complex formulations containing dozens of ingredients. Families pass down knowledge of kitchen remedies, the same herbs their great-grandmothers used, while universities conduct modern pharmacological research on these ancient plants, seeking to understand precisely how they interact with human physiology. The story takes different turns in other parts of the world. In much of Africa, traditional healers remain the primary healthcare providers for the majority of the population, with the World Health Organization estimating that up to 80% of Africans rely on traditional medicine for their primary healthcare needs. These healers, often called sangomas or traditional health practitioners, work with extensive knowledge of local plants, passed down through generations of apprenticeship. In recent decades, efforts have increased to document this knowledge and integrate traditional healers into formal healthcare systems, recognizing both the practical reality of their role and the value of their botanical expertise. Across the Americas, indigenous healing traditions persist despite centuries of disruption. In the Amazon rainforest, shamans continue to work with the extraordinary biodiversity surrounding them, using plants that Western science has only begun to catalogue. Some indigenous communities have established their own programs to document and preserve their medicinal plant knowledge, concerned that younger generations growing up with access to modern conveniences might not learn the traditional ways. These efforts often involve collaborations with ethnobotanists and anthropologists, creating written and video records of knowledge that was always meant to be transmitted orally, from healer to apprentice, in the forest itself. In the United States and Canada, herbal medicine occupies a complicated position. Sold as dietary supplements rather than drugs, herbs are available in every pharmacy and supermarket, yet they exist in a regulatory category that requires less rigorous testing than pharmaceutical medications. This creates a landscape where quality and potency can vary enormously between products. Some manufacturers follow pharmaceutical-grade practices, while others produce preparations of uncertain composition. Meanwhile, naturopathic physicians, herbalists, and integrative medicine practitioners work to bridge traditional plant knowledge with contemporary health concerns, often navigating a healthcare system that doesn't quite know how to categorize their work. Europe beyond Germany presents a patchwork of approaches. In France, herbal medicine has long been integrated into medical practice, with physicians who specialize in phytotherapy, the medical use of plant extracts. The United Kingdom has seen a revival of interest in herbal medicine, though practitioners remain outside the conventional healthcare system. Switzerland recognizes 5 complementary medicine disciplines, including herbal medicine, as legitimate healthcare approaches. Each nation has developed its own way of relating to plant-based healing, influenced by cultural history, scientific traditions, and healthcare philosophy. The global market for herbal medicines has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry, with some traditional remedies becoming household names worldwide. Ginkgo biloba, barely known outside Asia a few decades ago, now appears in products sold from Sydney to Stockholm. Turmeric, long central to both Ayurvedic medicine and Indian cuisine, has become a fashionable ingredient in lattes at trendy cafes. Echinacea, used by Native American tribes, is now cultivated commercially across multiple continents. This globalization of herbal medicine represents both opportunity and concern, as traditional remedies reach new populations while sometimes becoming disconnected from the cultural context that originally shaped their use. Professional organizations of herbalists have emerged in many countries, working to establish standards of practice and education. Training programs range from short workshops to multi-year degree courses, attempting to codify knowledge that was once learned through long apprenticeships. These efforts reflect a broader challenge: how to preserve and transmit traditional wisdom about medicinal plants in societies where fewer people grow their own food, much less forage for healing herbs. As our modern world continues its complex relationship with plant medicine, straddling ancient traditions and contemporary science, we find ourselves at a curious crossroads. The same plants that soothed our ancestors' ailments now undergo rigorous laboratory analysis. The wisdom of traditional healers becomes the subject of peer-reviewed studies. And somewhere in this intersection of old and new, plant medicine continues to evolve, adapting to our changing world while remaining rooted in the eternal relationship between humans and the green world that sustains us. This brings us to consider how these ancient plants find their way into modern laboratories, and the journey from rainforest to research center, that we shall explore next. The morning mist still clings to the canopy as Dr. Maria Santos carefully makes her way along a narrow trail deep in the Amazon rainforest. She's accompanied by Don Alberto, a traditional healer from a local indigenous community who has agreed to share his knowledge of the forest's medicinal plants. This scene, repeated in various forms across tropical forests, mountains, and remote valleys worldwide, represents the beginning of a fascinating journey that connects ancient wisdom with cutting-edge science. The process of discovering new plant medicines today is vastly different from the serendipitous findings of our ancestors. Yet it often begins in much the same way, with someone who knows the plants intimately. Ethnobotanists like Maria spend months or even years building relationships with traditional healers and indigenous communities, learning not just which plants are used for healing, but how they're prepared when they're harvested and what traditional knowledge systems have preserved about their properties over countless generations. Don Alberto pauses beside a vine with distinctive heart-shaped leaves. Through a translator, he explains that his grandfather taught him about this plant's use for persistent coughs, and his grandfather learned it from his own elders. The knowledge stretches back through an unbroken chain of oral tradition. Maria carefully collects a small sample, recording detailed notes about the plant's appearance, its exact location, the specific conditions it treats, and how it's traditionally prepared. Every detail matters, because this information will guide researchers thousands of miles away in their laboratories. Back in the laboratory, these precious plant samples begin a methodical journey through modern scientific analysis. First, botanists confirm the exact species, because closely related plants can have dramatically different properties. Then chemists begin the painstaking work of extraction and separation, using sophisticated techniques to isolate the various chemical compounds the plant contains. A single plant might produce hundreds of different molecules, each requiring analysis. Advanced instruments with names like mass spectrometers and nuclear magnetic resonance machines help scientists identify these compounds and understand their molecular structures. It's detective work at the smallest scale imaginable, revealing the intricate chemistry that plants have evolved over millions of years. Some compounds serve as the plant's defense against insects or fungi. Others help the plant communicate with neighbors or attract pollinators. And some, remarkably, interact with human biology in ways that can prevent or treat disease. Once promising compounds are identified, they move into the realm of pharmacology. Researchers test these molecules against specific biological targets, perhaps enzymes involved in inflammation, or proteins that cancer cells need to multiply, or receptors in the nervous system. This screening process has become increasingly sophisticated. Where scientists once tested compounds one by one, modern high-throughput screening can evaluate thousands of plant extracts against multiple disease targets simultaneously. The Madagascar periwinkle story illustrates this process beautifully. Traditional healers in Madagascar had long used this modest pink flower for various ailments. When researchers began studying it systematically in the 1950s, they discovered compounds called vincristine and vinblastine that proved remarkably effective against certain cancers. The journey from traditional use to modern medicine took years of careful study, clinical trials, and refinement, but it ultimately gave doctors powerful tools against childhood leukemia and Hodgkin's lymphoma. Today's plant medicine hunters also employ remarkable new technologies. DNA analysis helps identify plants and understand their evolutionary relationships, revealing which related species might share beneficial compounds. Geographic information systems map where medicinal plants grow, helping predict where else promising species might be found and whether their habitats are threatened. Massive databases catalog chemical structures and biological activities, allowing researchers to spot patterns and make predictions about which plants merit deeper investigation. Artificial intelligence is now joining the search. Machine learning algorithms can analyze vast amounts of data about plant chemistry, traditional uses, and biological activities, identifying patterns that human researchers might miss. These programs can predict which plants are most likely to yield compounds effective against specific diseases, helping scientists focus their efforts more efficiently. It's a powerful marriage of ancient botanical knowledge and 21st century computing power. The process doesn't end in the laboratory. Promising compounds must undergo rigorous clinical trials to prove they're both safe and effective in humans. This phase can take a decade or more and costs hundreds of millions of dollars. It's one reason why relatively few traditional remedies complete the journey to become approved medications, even when their traditional use spans centuries. Meanwhile, other researchers work to understand traditional preparations more thoroughly. Why do some healers insist on using the whole plant rather than isolated compounds? Scientists are discovering that plants often contain multiple active ingredients that work together synergistically, producing effects that no single compound achieves alone. This has led to renewed interest in studying plant extracts rather than just pure compounds, an approach that brings modern science full circle to embrace aspects of traditional practice. Conservation concerns add urgency to this work. Many medicinal plants grow only in threatened habitats, and some are already rare. Researchers race to document traditional knowledge before it's lost as younger generations move away from traditional practices. At the same time, they're developing methods to cultivate medicinal plants sustainably, or even produce their beneficial compounds through biotechnology, reducing pressure on wild populations. The ethical dimensions of this work have evolved significantly. Early plant explorers sometimes took traditional knowledge without acknowledging its sources or sharing benefits with the communities that preserved it. Today, most researchers work under benefit-sharing agreements, ensuring that indigenous and local communities receive recognition and compensation when their knowledge leads to commercial products. This more equitable approach recognizes that traditional knowledge represents generations of careful observation and experimentation, a different kind of research, but research nonetheless. From rainforest to laboratory, from traditional healer to molecular biologist, the discovery of plant medicines today weaves together multiple ways of knowing. It honors the wisdom preserved in oral traditions, while applying the rigorous methods of modern science. Each new compound identified, each traditional remedy validated or refined, adds another thread to humanity's ancient relationship with healing plants, a relationship that continues to evolve and surprise us with nature's pharmaceutical creativity. As we settle into the quiet hours of this final chapter, we turn our gaze forward, toward horizons yet unexplored in the ancient and ever-renewing relationship between plants and human health. The story of herbal medicine, which began countless millennia ago with our earliest ancestors tentatively tasting leaves and roots, continues to unfold in laboratories, botanical gardens, and research centers around our world today. In gleaming research facilities, artificial intelligence now assists scientists in ways that would have seemed pure magic to the herbalists of centuries past. Machine learning algorithms sift through vast databases of plant chemistry, comparing molecular structures against known biological targets, searching for promising combinations that human researchers might take years to identify. These digital tools can analyze thousands of plant compounds in mere hours, predicting which molecules might bind effectively to specific proteins in the human body, which might cross the blood-brain barrier, which might offer therapeutic benefits with minimal side effects. Yet even with all this computational power, the artificial intelligence relies fundamentally on data gathered through traditional methods, on knowledge accumulated plant by plant, generation by generation, across the span of human history. Synthetic biology opens remarkable new pathways in our relationship with medicinal plants. Rather than waiting for slow-growing trees to mature or harvesting rare species from threatened ecosystems, scientists can now transfer the genetic instructions for producing specific plant compounds into fast-growing microorganisms like yeast or bacteria. These microscopic factories, cultured in bioreactors, produce the same complex molecules that plants synthesize in their tissues, but more quickly and without depleting wild populations. The anti-malarial compound artemisinin, traditionally extracted from sweet wormwood plants, now flows from engineered yeast in commercial quantities, ensuring steady supplies of this life-saving medicine while reducing pressure on natural plant populations. The marriage of traditional knowledge and modern genomics reveals surprising connections in the plant world. Scientists sequence the genomes of medicinal plants, mapping the genes responsible for producing therapeutic compounds, understanding the biochemical pathways that create these complex molecules. This genetic knowledge allows researchers to identify related species that might harbor similar beneficial compounds, or to enhance production in cultivated plants through selective breeding that would have required decades using conventional methods. The opium poppy genome, sequenced in recent years, illuminates how this ancient medicinal plant produces its array of pain-relieving alkaloids, potentially pointing toward ways to produce these essential medicines through alternative methods. Nanotechnology introduces unprecedented precision to plant-based medicine. Researchers encapsulate herbal compounds in microscopic delivery vehicles, sometimes only billionths of a meter across, that can transport these molecules to specific tissues in the body. A plant compound that might normally be destroyed by stomach acid or metabolized too quickly by the liver can now be protected within a nanocapsule until it reaches its intended destination. These tiny carriers can even be designed to respond to specific conditions, releasing their botanical payload only when they encounter the particular temperature, acidity, or chemical signature of diseased tissue. The search for new medicinal plants continues with renewed urgency as researchers race against habitat loss and the disappearance of traditional knowledge. Ethnobotanists employ modern documentation methods using video recordings, digital herbarium specimens, and molecular analysis to capture information about plants and their uses before this wisdom vanishes with the passing of elders in indigenous communities. Satellite imagery and geographical information systems help identify biodiversity hotspots that might harbor undiscovered medicinal species. Automated chemical screening techniques allow researchers to test plant extracts for biological activity against numerous disease targets simultaneously, accelerating the pace of discovery. Climate change emerges as both a challenge and an unexpected source of botanical discovery. As temperature and rainfall patterns shift, plants alter their chemistry in response to environmental stress. Some produce different proportions of medicinal compounds or synthesize entirely new molecules as they adapt to changing conditions. Scientists monitor these changes, sometimes finding that stressed plants generate higher concentrations of therapeutically valuable substances. Meanwhile, rising temperatures allow the cultivation of medicinal plants in regions where they could not previously grow, potentially establishing new sources for important remedies while disrupting traditional growing areas. The concept of the holistic entourage effect gains scientific validation through modern analytical methods. Researchers discover that whole plant extracts often work differently than isolated single compounds, with various plant molecules interacting synergistically in ways that enhance therapeutic benefits or reduce side effects. Advanced spectrometry techniques reveal the full chemical complexity of herbal preparations, identifying minor compounds that modulate the activity of major active ingredients. This scientific understanding bridges ancient holistic approaches with molecular medicine, suggesting that traditional uses of whole plants sometimes reflect sophisticated, if intuitive, understanding of these interactions. Personalized medicine promises to revolutionize how plant-based remedies are selected and prescribed. Genetic testing can reveal how individual patients metabolize particular plant compounds, predicting who will benefit most from specific botanical treatments and who might experience adverse effects. The unique bacterial communities in each person's digestive system, now understood to play crucial roles in processing herbal medicines, can be analyzed to guide treatment selection. These personalized approaches echo traditional systems that recognized individual constitutional differences, now supported by molecular data. Conservation genetics provides tools for preserving medicinal plant diversity. Scientists establish seed banks and living collections of important medicinal species, with their genetic material carefully catalogued and stored under controlled conditions. Tissue culture techniques allow rare plants to be propagated without harvesting from wild populations. DNA barcoding helps identify plant materials accurately, combating the mislabeling and adulteration that sometimes plague herbal medicine markets. Looking further ahead, we glimpse possibilities still taking shape in research laboratories. Scientists explore using plants themselves as bioreactors, temporarily modifying living tissues to produce pharmaceutical compounds that the plants would not naturally make. Others investigate whether plant-based compounds might be customized at the molecular level, with small modifications to their chemical structure, enhancing their effectiveness while maintaining the favorable properties that hundreds of millions of years of plant evolution have refined. The ancient art of herbalism finds new expression through modern technology. Mobile applications connect users with plant identification systems and databases of traditional uses. Online platforms allow traditional healers and scientific researchers to share knowledge across continents and cultures. Three-dimensional molecular modeling lets students explore the shapes of plant compounds and visualize how they interact with human proteins, understanding through spatial representation what earlier generations learned through careful observation and accumulated experience. As our journey through the story of herbal medicine draws to a close, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at a point of convergence, where ancient wisdom and cutting-edge science intertwine. The plants that have accompanied humanity through our long history continue to offer healing, now understood through ever more sophisticated lenses, yet retaining the fundamental mystery of their green life, their quiet chemistry, their patient growth toward light. In laboratories and gardens, in rainforests and research centers, the conversation between plants and people continues, as it has since the first curious human tasted a leaf and felt relief, as it will continue into futures we can barely imagine, beneath the steady, silent watch of the green world that has always held such unexpected gifts for those who seek with care and patience and wonder. As we bring to a close our journey through the timeless story of herbal medicine, from ancient healers gathering plants under moonlight to the laboratories where scientists unlock nature's secrets, we hope these gentle tales have carried you peacefully through the evening. Thank you for joining us on this soothing exploration of humanity's enduring connection with the natural world. If these calm adventures have brought you comfort, we'd love to have you with us again. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And now, as the night deepens and your mind settles into stillness, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer, and may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.